Azarok Sector, Kemiros System. 742.m32. With the slowness and inevitability of principles older than life in the universe, Kemiros turned around its star. From orbit, the world was beautiful. Its night side was illuminated by millions of points of light, in cities the size of the nation of old Earth's distant past, in which dwelt billions of imperial citizens. The side of it exposed to the light of its sun glowed as its unending cloud cover reflected most of the heat away at the same time it trapped that which did pass through. Poets had marveled at the spectacle, speaking of the wondrous union of light and dark. Tech priests too had found the scene beautiful, albeit for an entirely too different reason. They marveled at the precise chemical composition of the cloud cover, designed in ancient times by men who had been conquerors of the stars, rather than heirs to an ever-diminishing empire. By carefully balancing the composition of the cloud cover, the adepts of Kemiros could prevent the world's temperature from rising to the point it had to be abandoned. But these calculations had a price, and that price was all the beauty Kemiros had ever possessed when seen up close. The planet's ecosystem was dead, and had been dead for more than 3,000 years. Between the cities, there was only dust, immense deserts of polluted ash and sand. Great storms that could strip the flesh from a man's bones raged there, and the cities of Kemiros were only spared from their wrath because of the walls surrounding them. Built during the dark age of technology using secrets now lost and artificial materials whose origin had long been forgotten, these walls reached up to the limits of the planet's breathable atmosphere. Within these walls were the hallowed cogitators and machines that purified the city's air, recycled their water, and preserved the delicate chemical balance of pollutants that prevented the world from turning into a furnace. Thousands of tech priests dwelled in each of these megastructures, maintaining their workings with rituals that had been passed down for generations before the Imperium had conquered Kemiros, and whose meaning had been forgotten centuries ago. The walls prevented the storms from destroying the cities, but also cast a nearly permanent shadow over them. Days were short and nights long on Kemiros. And without the ability to expand outward, the cities had gone down, digging into the planet's mantle to build still more dens and manufactorums. All travel between cities had to be done using orbital transports, for no vehicle could brave the storms, be it by land or air. Or at least that's what most of the population believed, and for the most part they were correct. Civilian vehicles couldn't, not reliably enough to be profitable. That didn't stop treasure hunters from wandering out, of course, seeking the riches that were said to have been left behind by the old masters of the world, before the coming of the Emperor. Almost none of them returned. And of those, none had ever found anything of value. But legends kept circulating among the millions of men and women slaving away in the manufactorums, and every year, hundreds of would-be treasure hunters sacrificed their meager possessions for dilapidated equipment and dubious ancient maps. There was only one structure that stood outside of the wall's protection. A circular tower of black rock, 200 meters high and utterly featureless. No one, not even the most crazed of treasure hunter, got near it. The dunes around it hid countless defenses, auspex arrays and traps that could murder an entire army trying to make its way to the single door at the base of the tower. Even should someone reach the door, they would find out that it couldn't be opened, for it was merely a trap to lure them beneath guns with enough firepower to tear a baneblade apart. This, as everyone on Kemiros knew, was the Inquisition's headquarters on the planet, center of their operations in the entire Azarok sector. They had other estates, buildings branded with their symbol in each of the planet's cities, and doubtlessly countless others that were hidden from all prying eyes, but this was where their power truly was. Behind those walls, the lords and ladies of the Inquisition held countless heretics and traitors, breaking them so that they could learn what they needed to know to do the Emperor's work. To be captured by the Inquisition meant to be brought to the tower, and to be brought to the tower meant that you were dead. And that, of course, was a lie. The tower was a decoy, just like its door. The true headquarters of the Inquisition laid on the other side of the planet, several hundred meters below the surface, and could only be accessed through 5 different entry points scattered through the desert, each at least 100 kilometers away from the headquarters themselves. All 5 entry points were hidden, trapped, and once you passed them you still had to find your way through a labyrinth of tunnels where only one path led to the headquarters, where even more verifications would take place before you would finally be allowed in. Any failure to provide the correct credentials would result in immediate capture or elimination. Such were the means by which the Azarok Conclave protected its privacy. In the last 2,000 years since this place had been dug, there had been many who had argued that this was going too far, that other conclaves in other sectors didn't practice nearly as much paranoia in the defense of their headquarters. They pointed at the expenses, the burden of having valuable and trusted agents bringing in supplies from the outside when they could have been doing useful work. But these protesting voices were outnumbered by those older, more cynical souls that argued that in fact, these defenses weren't enough and should be made even more draconian. Thousands of souls called the underground fortress home. Many of them had never known anything else, born to bloodlines that had been in service to the Inquisition for generations, children inheriting the duties of parents whose union had been approved by their masters. Servants, guards, archivists, tech priests, menials, all were marked with a stylized eye upon their forehead, some on a metal ring, others tattooed on their skin. The fortress was their home, but none of them had seen it all, for there were parts of it that were forbidden to even the most exalted of their isolated society. Those were the places that were reserved to their masters, for the prosecution of their grim and solemn duty. They wondered at what might take place there, and told stories of the great deeds of their lords. An old tradition was for children to dare each other to go look what the lords did in these sealed chambers, and another, just as old tradition, was that absolutely none of them ever took the dare. For their parents knew what the punishment would be for any who intruded upon the Inquisitors, even if they were but children pushed by curiosity. No matter how many times Noriof Eldenswen stood at the center of the many-tiered amphitheater where the Azeroth conclave met, he always felt as if he were in an arena rather than a space for discussion and debate. He was at eye level with the highest tiers, risen from the ground on a small pulpit, prevented from the risk of falling by a waist-high silver fence. He could feel gazes on his back from the Inquisitors sitting behind him. By design, even the Lord Inquisitor who led the conclave could not look upon all of his colleagues at once. It was unsubtle symbolism, but the Inquisition was not above hammering a point home using crude allegory when it could. Only Inquisitors were allowed here, in this most secret and defended of spaces. Wards had been engraved on every stone to prevent sorcerers scrying, and the single entrance was sealed by a succession of 3 adamantium gates that each required a rosette and a passphrase to open. The construction had followed geomantic patterns and used special rock that disturbed psychic power. Noriof was feeling the beginning of a headache, and suppressed it with an effort of will. He could not afford to be distracted by pain, he never could here, not with such duties as the one he must bear. It often struck him as ridiculous that he was sometimes more relaxed on a battlefield that he was facing his peers, that by such ways was the Inquisition kept strong and pure. The pupil turned slowly in answer to his thoughts, and he took in the view of his gathering peers. They weren't all here yet, but the call had been given, transmitted through all the fortress into the private rooms of the Inquisitors and their retinues. All Inquisitors who would come to the conclave were already on Chemairos. It had been more than 6 months since the gathering aboard the Blind Eye, and the astropathic summons had been sent and answered. More than 70 Inquisitors had come to the sector's capital, bringing with them hundreds of acolytes and other regents. That still left about 30 unaccounted for in Azeroth. Of those, half had sent word that they could not attend, while the other half had not given any sign they had received the summons in the first place. Perhaps they hadn't, and perhaps they were involved in matters so secretive and important they would not abandon them, even for a matter as dire as the one Noriof had implied in his call. Of course, the 8 who had met on the station had been far from inactive during these months. With a threat like the one they dreaded on the horizon, half a year was an unacceptable time to waste. They had sent warnings to their contacts across the imperial branches of the sector, called in favors and smoothed the gears for the administrative work that would be required in case reinforcements were needed. They had also made ready for war themselves, increasing the size of their retinues and arming them. And they had continued to search for plots of the chained demon head. None of them could leave the system and risk missing the conclave, and so Chemairos had enjoyed the watchful eyes of 8 Inquisitors for the last 6 months. They had hunted mutants and heretics across the entire world, searching high and low, for experience had taught them that the enemy they hunted did not restrict its corrupt touch to a single segment of imperial society. And they had found plenty of heresy to purge, for Chemairos was the heart of the Azeroth sector, a world of power and influence, and those bred heretics almost as much as the touch of the Wailing Storm did. Gregory had broken a cabal of merchants who had used unlicensed psychers to try and predict the ebbs and flows of the planet's financial markets, unheeding of the terrible risks of demonic incursions. Logan had destroyed a gang boss that had been corrupted by an artifact of Xeno's origin that had transformed him into a man-eating abomination that had used its influence in the underworld to keep itself fed for more than 2 decades. Linessa and her acolytes had hunted down and killed a beast that had haunted the underhive of Akrata for 200 years, an unholy amalgam of flesh and prescribed cybernetics whose dissection would probably lead to some very pointed inquiries to the local Margus biologist. Matthias had personally supervised the slow execution of a quartermaster for the local PDF who had purchased cheap, mutated meat to feed his charges and kept the remaining money for himself. Gales had dismantled a contraband ring selling fake remnants of Imperial saints, some of which had indeed been relics, but dark and corrupting ones, tainted by the touch of ruin. But of the chained demon head, they had found no sign. And though Noryov would never have admitted it out loud, that scared him more than if every heresy they had uncovered had borne its mark. It seemed unlikely to him, and, he knew, to his colleagues as well, that the sector-wide conspiracy they had unveiled would refrain from action on Chemairos. Either there was some reason that had prevented the heretics behind the symbol from doing that, or they had simply failed to find the plots that were there. Still, their presence had other effects on Chemairos. The rich and powerful of the hive world walked softly and spoke only after considering their words a few more times than usual. Word of the Inquisitor's presence had even trickled down to the underhive, and the last 6 months had seen a remarkable decrease in criminal activity. No one wanted to risk drawing their attention, even those who had done nothing more than extort protection money from small shops or kill someone from a rival gang. Noryov had seen the numbers with his own eyes, sent to him by the local arbits. The lawmen were glad of the decrease, but those with half a brain knew that as soon as the Inquisitors left after the conclave, things would go back to normal with a vengeance. They were actively stockpiling weapons and armor in preparation for the inevitable explosion of unleashed violence. Noryov had discreetly encouraged them, another small thing added to the preparations, but small things tended to pile up. As for Silviana and Alphon, they had worked together to unlock the meaning of Marcus Helden's visions, a fact that had surprised Noryov. He hadn't expected Alphon would consider working with one of his peers, yet the two of them had come to Chemairos together and hardly spent a moment apart since. In the Tower of Astropaths, they had scoured records and questioned men and women who had spent their entire lives divining the meaning of riddles whispered across the stars. What they had felt confident enough to share with Noryov had worried him greatly. The visions of Helden had been far from isolated, and many astropaths had been lost in the last years, driven to insanity by horrifying visions. All of them were here in the conclave, leaving their ongoing investigations into the hands of their acolytes so that they could be present at the gathering. Noryov wouldn't say anything they didn't already know, but it was important that they were here all the same, to provide support if some in the Ordos refused to accept that the danger was real. Obsession was a very real risk for all Inquisitors, the focus on one specific threat until all others seemed either false or secondary. "Greetings, my esteemed colleagues," Noryov began. "No doubt you are all wondering why you were called here. I know many of you have your suspicions, you wouldn't be doing your Emperor-appointed task otherwise, so, allow me to cut right to the heart of the matter. Time, I believe, is of the essence. The reason why I issued the call that brought you here was partly explained in the message itself. As it said, I have reason to believe that a new, sector-wide threat has appeared. A succession of heretical plots across Azeroth, each relatively minor in their own right, but all connected by a common thread, speaks of the power behind this threat." That got their interest. For all that they had various opinions and beliefs on the means by which the Imperium must be protected, or on which threats were the direst among the myriad that surrounded mankind from all sides, all those in the conclave had dedicated their lives, their souls, to that singular goal. "I fear that war is coming once more to Azeroth, hailing from the Wailing Storm," he continued. "The powers responsible for the creation of this infernal realm are returning, my brethren, rising from the pit of their own making to seek the destruction of all that we hold dear. Already they have struck to weaken the defenses of the sector, to spread ruin and corruption among its rulers and dissension and heresy among its people. There have always been attempts by the ruinous powers to subvert the rule of the God Emperor, called out Elidios Ikaman, rising from his seat, and there will always be, until the stars go dark. What makes you think that these incidents you speak of are connected?" Unlike most other Inquisitors present, Ikaman stood alone, his peers leaving a wide space between him and them, with the closest being Alphon, who also stood alone. Tall and noble-looking, He was the very image of an inquisitor, with his dark eyes and short, black hair lending him an intimidating air. Like almost every other inquisitor in the room, he was dressed as if on a dangerous investigation in hostile territory, an habit most members of the Ordosh picked up early in their careers. Even those who operated by mingling with imperial society, they were just more subtle about it. A plasma pistol whose strange design marked it as possibly older than the Imperium itself hung at his belt, and he held in his right hand the long staff of adamantium-laced wood that ended in a beautiful sculpture of a two-head eagle holding the Inquisition's sigil in its claws. Belonging to the Ordo Malleus, Elidios was extremely young for his station by the Inquisition's standards, barely 50 years old and only an inquisitor for 13 of those. He had received his rosette from the hand of his master as the man lay dying in the dirt of an underhive on Chemairos itself, mortally wounded by a demon summoned by a chaos cult that Ackerman had later hunted down and exterminated with all due thoroughness, proving his worth to his detractors. His youth, however, wasn't the reason for his isolation, nor the priceless piece of archaeotech he was flaunting. It was his open radicalism that was responsible for that. Like his master before him, Ackerman believed that knowledge of the archenemy was needed to face it with any hope of success. That much was accepted by most demon hunters, but Ackerman went further than that. He believed that the knowledge of the foe could, and indeed must, be used against it. He had actively studied the sorcerous books his master had taken from the cults he had destroyed, unholy works the old man hadn't dared destroy lest he release the fell powers contained within. His knowledge of dark lore had enabled him to win several great victories against the minions of chaos, such as his banishment of the Child of Anarchy, a powerful demon host that had been on the verge of plunging the entire world of Meliera into madness. Details about the battle were scarce, but from the reports Norioff had received, Ackerman had faced the creature alone after it had slaughtered his team and managed to emerge the victor, a feat made even more impressive by his lack of psychic abilities of his own. Of course, the entire city in which the confrontation had occurred had needed purging afterwards, but the few millions of lives lost were more than balanced by the billions that would have been damned if the Child of Anarchy's plot to spread a chaos-infected metal meme across the planet's Vox grid had succeeded. As far as Norioff knew, Ackerman hadn't fallen into the other traps of radicalism. He hadn't employed the weapons of the enemy against it, nor wielded the sorcerous knowledge he had acquired for anything other than banishing already manifested demons. In the older Inquisitor's opinion, that should have meant he wasn't a true radical at all, having only broken the tenet prescribing the study of the dismal texts. But it was enough to draw suspicion upon him, with many believing it was only a matter of time before he slipped further, if he hadn't already done so and managed to conceal it. The Azarok sector, after all, had a history with radical inquisitors and the consequences of their meddling in things best left unknown. Ackerman's question wasn't a challenge to Norioff's authority, though many would have taken it as such. It was genuine curiosity, and a display of the young Inquisitor's deductive skills that he could guess there was more to the Lord Inquisitor's proclamation of a sector-wide conspiracy. But even now, Norioff wouldn't expose the existence of the Circle of the Blind Eye. Its existence didn't break any of the Inquisition's rules, spoken or unspoken, but exposing it would remove much of its usefulness in the future. It wasn't enough for the Lord Inquisitor to think of the current threat, he had to think of those who would come after, and preserve the assets that would be needed then. He would spread the details of their investigations. Of course, it was all too possible another Inquisitor would notice a pattern they had missed or recognize something from one of his own efforts against the enemies of humanity. But he would be careful, first trying to see if any of the others had encountered the symbol that had linked all the occurrences before revealing the original sources. However, he needed to answer Ackerman's question, for surely many others were thinking it. Fortunately, he had been prepared for it. Yet before he could open his mouth to reply in vague but calming terms, Gailey's servitors rose, unbidden, and a dark sense of foreboding fell upon Norioff. All of those were linked by a common symbol, began Gailey's, found in different shapes, the image of an infernal visage surrounded by a circle of chain. The power of the warp, bound into service by those with the will to reach out and seize it. The signs are clear, Elidios. There is a new power rising in this part of the galaxy, one that has managed to avoid the Conclave's eyes until now. For long, it has gathered its strength, spreading its influence throughout the Azarok sector, while we remained blind to its presence. And now, he took a deep breath before continuing, his voice growing stronger with every word until he was screaming the last ones, his expression suddenly twisted into a demented smile, his single flesh eye glowing with maddened fervor. Now it is too late. None of you can stand against the coming night. The end has come. Kneel before the power of the Forsaken Sons, or know their wrath." As cries of outrage rose from the assembled inquisitors as Gailey's defeatist, treacherous words, he pulled something from his vest. Noriov's eyes fell upon it, and time seemed to slow as both his mundane and psychic sight recoiled at what they beheld. The object was a sphere of translucent material, within which roiled black and crimson smoke in patterns that seared his soul. With a particularly loud shout of "Heretic!" a bolt pistol was fired from somewhere in the audience, but the shell crashed harmlessly against the sizzling sphere of energy that now surrounded the revealed renegade. A rosarios hanging around his neck flared as it dissipated the energy of the blow, and Noriov's heart sank as he recognized it as an ecclesiarchy device, rather than one acquired from the Mechonicus through inquisitorial channels. Gales rose the sphere above his head, and threw it down the amphitheater, at the foot of Noriov's pedestal. It shattered with the sound of shrieking souls, and the sorcerous smoke that had been contained within grew, spreading in tendrils that burned out the warding sigils upon contact. The strength of the explosion shattered the pillar of Noriov's podium, and the old Inquisitor deployed his powers to slow his fall, landing in the section of the amphitheater opposite Gales. He shouldn't have been able to call upon his psychic abilities here, but reflex had made him try to anyway. Dread filled his mind at the implication, made even worse by the unholy words he heard from behind the curtain of smoke, that his experience identified as an incantation calling upon powers no sane human being should ever wield. "What have you done?" he roared, his voice echoing through the chamber as he drew in more of his power, acutely feeling the taint spilling across the room along the smoke, but willing to risk it. All around him inquisitors were preparing for battle, rising all manners of weapons. No reply came, save for a strange, demented laughter that could not possibly come from Gales, yet Noriov's mind recognized the voice as such. Then the smoke cloud was suddenly parted as if by a gust of wind, revealing two figures standing at the bottom of the amphitheater. The sight of the taller of them froze Noriov in place, for its size and shape were impossible to mistake for anything other than a warrior of the Adeptus Astartes. The traitor marine's armor was painted black and gold, and for a moment Noriov thought that, against all reason, the Black Legion had somehow managed to reach into the Azarok sector, so far from their lair in the Eye of Terror. However, the emblem painted on the warrior's right shoulder pad wasn't the eightfold star of chaos with the Eye of Horus glaring from the center, but the familiar image of the chained demon head. Further indicating the Astartes' corrupt nature was his archaic helm, which was crowned by a pair of horns that twisted together in hypnotic patterns, and the staff of black metal he held, still the blasphemous runes engraved upon its length still glowing with warplight from his sorcerer's arrival. Never before had Noriov seen a being of such psychic power. It surpassed even that of the chief librarian of the heirs of Sanguinius, whom he had met once 100 years ago, at the onset of a particularly grueling campaign of purification. His aura blazed in Noriov's psychic sight, seemingly alive with all the malevolence that dwelled within the sorcerer's tainted soul. Pride, greed, and hate all mingled together in a repugnant mix, and a deep crimson shadow loomed over him. And yet, the traitor's might paled in comparison to the abomination at his side. Covered in a robe of what appeared to be black velvet, 4 glowing eyes looked out from the shadows of a long hood. 2 four-fingered hands emerged from the sleeves of the robe, their purple skin catching the light of the torches in patterns that seemed to cause the shadows around them to twist unnaturally. At first, the old Inquisitor thought that it was some kind of mutant, but as he got a better view of the creature, he realized with horror that this was instead some foul Xenos. What manner of perversion, he wondered, had led one of the Emperor's space marines, even one fallen into the Dark God's wretched embrace, to an alliance with such a wretched creature? "So," said the Chaos Marine, making a show of looking at the gathered conclave and shaking his head in mock disbelief. "This is what has become of the Imperium, that it entrusts its safety to those such as you. A gathering of cliques and factions, more interested in their own interests than the good of those you claim to protect, united only in their desire to keep the truth out of the hands of mankind. How very imperial of you." "Who are you?" shouted Noriov, now shaping the power he had drawn to himself for one devastating strike, though he doubted that would have any effect on so powerful a duo of heretics, to dare stand before the Emperor's own agents. "I am Arsim," replied the sorcerer, bowing with a grand flourish that couldn't have made his mockery any clearer. "Lord of the Coven, chosen of the Awakened One. I would like to say that I am your death, But that title will come to my friend here. Introduce yourself, would you, my dear? I am Carthago, came another voice, burning through his mind with every word, and the pain was so strong that his mind could barely connect the name to Logan's report. There was a feeling to the words, a taint, different from the mark of the arch-enemy but just as vile, that marked them as emanating from the Xenos rather than the Chaos Sorcerer. I am the sins of empires come back to punish those who committed them. Then the creature raised its hands, and the doom of the Azeroth conclave began to unfold. From his position in the amphitheater, Alphon was able to see Norioth's demise. The first attack from the alien psyker came in the form of a deluge of kinetic blows, scattered across the entire amphitheater. For a few seconds, Norioth held his ground, the air around him shimmering as he used his own power to hold back the blow directed at him, but then, all of a sudden, his efforts failed, and he was crushed into pulp along with an entire section of the amphitheater. Suppressing a cry of anguish at the death of the old Inquisitor, who had been one of his few allies and friends in the conclave, Alphon added the fire of his own weapon to the hail of projectiles aimed by the Inquisitors at the two monsters in their midst. None seemed to do any damage, turned aside by a shield of warp energy. Considering the fact that none of the conclave's psychic Inquisitors had managed to kill the intruders yet, and Alphon knew for certain that several of them held quite considerable power, the inevitable conclusion quickly rose in his mind. Alpha-class Psyker. There were many things that gave Inquisitors nightmare, but these words were near the top of the list. Of all those with the dubious blessing of being able to draw upon the chaotic powers of the warp, these were the most powerful, barely in control of their tremendous abilities more often than not. Mercifully, these individuals were incredibly rare, but each of them was a threat to the entire sector blighted by their presence. They could enslave entire worlds, and when they inevitably succumbed to demonic possessions, their death didn't simply allow a very powerful demon to manifest, it ripped a hole into reality through which entire infernal hordes could pour. The fact that the Xenos didn't appear to be burning from the inside with its power was a meager comfort, the notion that it had found a way to control its power more than balancing any relief that no demonic incursion was incoming. Even as he continued firing harmlessly, Alphon's mind was reeling with the implications of a chaos force allied with a Xenos psyker. It was hardly unheard of for the minions of ruin to sully their souls further with such unholy alliances. The Black Crusade of Abaddon had been supported with creatures from various species. The taint of the ruinous powers was universal, even if they coveted the soul of mankind more than any other. The hail of las bolts and other gunfire was suddenly reinforced, as Gregory Irwin, most powerful pyromancer in the sector, unleashed a torrent of flames hot enough to melt ferrocrete at the foe. Before the fire could reach the protective shield around the pair of heretics, however, the sorcerer raised his free hand. The stream of white-hot flames burst into several smaller streams that turned back the way they had come, reducing Gregory to ash before the Inquisitor could react. Blinking away the after-images the pyromantic display had left on his retinas, Alphon saw the traitor, Gales, jump over the barrier between the amphitheater's seats and the central space, advancing toward the sorcerer and Xenos psyker with a repulsive expression of adoration on his face. More alarmingly, Alphon could also see Sylviana rushing after the apostate, her metallic body not carrying visible weapons, but her bare hands had more than enough strength to rip Gales' head from his shoulders. "Sylviana!" he called out. "Don't!" Before he could finish his warning, Gales turned toward the cybernetic Inquisitor. He struck with his cane, and spat a single word that, even from this distance, caused Alphon's vision to swim. 5 of Gales' teeth exploded with the words power, and his left arm violently bent in the wrong direction with a sickening crunch. But the effect was much more dramatic on Sylviana. Like a cloth doll caught in the rotating blade of some agri-world harvesting machine, her body was torn apart by unseen energies the moment the cane touched her, shining metallic fragments cast in all direction. Her limbs and head were ripped off, and her torso savagely battered by invisible claws. Alphon's rage soared at the sight. In the last few months, he and Sylviana had, during their work together, developed a respect for the skills of the other, and to see his colleague so casually destroyed made his blood boil. To his own mild surprise, he found himself moving to confront Gales himself, bolt pistol in hand without remembering having drawn it, only to be stopped by a firm hand landing on his shoulder. He turned to see Elidio Zickerman, his face set in a mask of cold focus, shaking his head. "Don't do anything foolish," said the radical grimly. "We have got to do something," protested Alphon. I know. I have a plan. Stay close to me. There was something in the younger man's voice that convinced Alphon to heed his words, despite the anger he felt. Unbeknownst to the rest of the conclave, even the late Elden Swen, Alphon and Elidios had been allies of a sort for a long time, with Alphon giving intelligence that Elidios could best put to use to thwart the designs of the Emperor's foes. Never before had they been in an actual battle before, but Alphon suspected his junior still had much more experience in this than him. Besides, he was Malleus, this was his area of expertise. Elidios rammed his staff onto the ground, his lips moving wordlessly, and the sound of the impact echoed amidst the chamber far louder than it ought to. The noise drew the gaze of the sorcerer, just as his alien pet annihilated the last members of the Blind Eyes Circle. Logan, Linessa and Matthias all perished together, their bodies reduced to pulp by the unbridled power of the Alpha Plus Witch, and Alphon's heart bled for them, to encounter such ignoble deaths after so long spent in illustrious service to the throne. "Ah," whispered the traitor, his voice echoing through the amphitheater, desecrating the acoustics of the chamber with the taint it carried. "It looks like there is at least one of you who might be worthy of my time. But what do you hope to accomplish, little magician?" Elidios ignored the taunt of the fallen angel, instead continuing to weave the arcane symbols in front of him, his left hand abandoning its hold over the staff. Alphon could see the runes now, glimmering softly into the air in front of his colleague's crossed hands. He could also see that whatever Elidios was doing, it was taking a toll on him. Blood was dripping from his mouth, and nearly every muscle in his body was tense with unspoken effort and suffering. "I encountered one of Malcador's 12, hissed the sorcerer, his anger at being ignored plain to see, when terror burned in the fires of Horus' rebellion. I battled him while my brothers tried to take back what your kind had stolen from my legion, matching my power against his gifts while living gods battled above us. Compared to him, you are nothing but a child playing with powers you do not understand, unaware of both dangers and costs." "I am a servant of the God Emperor," shouted Elidios, serving his will, blessed by his light. The sorcerer laughed, a bitter and mirthless laugh that spoke of betrayed hopes and ruined dreams. "Do you really believe that?" he said spitefully. "The only reason you are able to defy me, instead of dying pointlessly like the rest, is because you possess the same knowledge me and my brothers were cast out for the crime of seeking. You are no psyker, little man. These runes you are tracing, I recognize them well. What do you think that rotten corpse on the golden throne would say if he could see you, and still speak, rather than moan his agonies throughout the sea of souls for the amusement of the true powers? Do not seek to weaken my resolve with your insane delusions, slave of chaos," replied Elidios between gritted teeth, his hands still moving at all speed to weave symbols in the air. "I am no traitor. I seek no reward for myself, no power or glory, merely to do my duty. That is the difference between us, renegade. You fell because you placed your own selfish desires and thirst for knowledge above all else. Everything I do for the Emperor." "So did we," roared the traitor Marine, and Alphon believed that, amidst all the anger and hatred, he detected a note of genuine sorrow. "But the corpse god doesn't care for motives, Inquisitor. He never has. All that matters to him is that you obey his orders without ever questioning them, even when they don't make sense, even when they lead to countless deaths. What worth is there in following such a tyrant? What honor, when you are naught but a tool in his eyes? Would you serve a lord who punishes any initiative, any free thinking, with execution? Your lies mean nothing to me, heretic." The air crackled with energy as whatever the radical was doing reached its climax. Elidios' voice rose in strength, as if he was truly the vessel of the Emperor's own wrath. "Begone from his realm, and go back to your infernal pit." The sigils were completed, and the air before the Inquisitor shone with sorcerous power. Crackling energy leapt from the floating runes, hammering against the shield around the heretics. Where the onslaught of the rest of the conclave had failed to inflict any damage, this attack had some effect. The sorcerer swayed, barely remaining on his feet, and the Xeno's psyche shrieked in pain, raising its hands to its head. More bolts hit as Elidios began to speak words in a long-dead language that set Alphon's teeth on edge, and the figures within the shield began to shimmer, as if they were faulty hollow projections. The sorcerer roared his anger, and reached out with his free hand, unleashing a telekina bolt of his own that rippled through the air like heat distortion. All too aware that Elidios was the only one with any hope of stopping the massacre, Alphon leapt in the way of the attack, taking the bolt right in the chest. Its power spread across his limbs, and he was sent flying, crashing several levels higher in the amphitheater. He felt no pain, which told him he was in a very bad state. From where he laid on his back, he saw the culmination of the confrontation between Elidios and the creature that called itself Arsim. With the time Alphon had bought, the radical had been able to finish his spell, and Sorcerer and Xenos Psyker alike screamed in thwarted fury as the very streams of unnatural power that had brought them to this place now snatched them away. There was a flash of unlight, and the sound of distant, mocking screams, before the cacophony of battle abruptly ended, and nothing remained at the center of the ruined conclave but cracked stone and scorch marks. "Gales?" croaked Alphon once enough of the shock had passed for him to breath, his gaze sweeping the ravaged amphitheater. He could not see the foul traitor anywhere. Just as he said the words, sensation began to return in full, and he moaned in delayed pain. His whole body was a tapestry of hurts, and his mind immediately began to catalogue them. Both his legs and arms were broken, and he felt that several of his ribs were now fragments grinding against each other with every breath he took. His head pulsed with a hateful headache, which was strange since he did not remember anything hitting it, and if the telekina blast had damaged his skull, surely his brain would be spread out on the ground. Likely, he had been hit by a flying piece of stone during the fight. In the heat of battle, it was all too frequent to not notice one had been harmed until the fight was over and the adrenaline ceased to hold the pain at bay. "Gone," spat Elidios. "That sorcerer and its Xenos pet took him with them when I reversed the sorcery that brought them here in the first place." The radical was struggling to his feet, weighing on his frost-covered staff. Blood dripped from his mouth and ears, and his right eye was wide open as the left one was screwed shut, a pale liquid flowing slowly from it. He took a look at Alphon, and shook his head. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice gentle but firm. "You will kill yourself if you try to move in your state. I will go and get help, if I can convince any of the aid to get in there, of course. Bloody security, I always said we were being too paranoid with keeping our secrets." "I somehow doubt any number of armsmen would have made a difference," pointed out Alphon, despite the pain speaking caused in his chest. "Maybe," admitted Elidios, "but we would have Medicae here sooner." While Alphon understood the need for secrecy and all the other arguments in favor of the conclave meeting in the most isolated and well-hidden place possible, his current situation made him unwilling to argue the point. All he could do was nod weakly, and attempt to hold on to his consciousness, for he was fairly certain that, if he succumbed to the blackness creeping in at the edge of his sight, he would never wake again. Even so, his awareness of what the next few hours entailed was fuzzy at best. After what seemed like an eternity but couldn't have been more than a few minutes, Elidios brought back assistance from the rest of the fortress, having apparently convinced the thralls that the prohibition against entering the room was outweighed by the great need for assistance of their masters. Alphon remembered figures above him, and a sharp pain in his right arm, soon followed by a blessed release from his suffering as the painkillers did their work. Only then did he finally allow himself to fall into unconsciousness. He woke an indeterminate amount of time later, covered in bandages, laying in one of the infirmary's beds, cut off from the rest of the room by a white sheet. The smell of blood, disinfectant and other medical products was strong, and he could hear soft wails of pain from his surroundings. A needle was still stabbed in his right arm, surrounded by an array of sensors, all linked to some contraption that started to beep as it registered his return to wakefulness. Alphon remained immobile, having been injured enough time to know that any attempt at motion he made now would only result in a brief flash of pain, quickly followed by a return to sleep as the machine pumped more drugs into his body in response to his agitation. Some corner of his mind idly noticed that perhaps he should have tried to avoid gaining such experience in the first place. Then the memory of what had led to him being here hit him like a brick, and he was almost drugged back into sleep anyway as his heart started pounding in his chest with delayed fear and grief. It took him a few minutes to calm down enough that he could think about what the attack meant, and the picture his mind painted was a grim one indeed. Eldon Swen was dead, along with every other member of the Blind Eyes Circle apart from him and Gaeles, but the Emperor damned traitor didn't count, and almost the entirety of the Azarok conclave. He didn't know how many had survived like him and Elidios, but that number couldn't have been high. The Inquisition's presence in the sector had been dealt a terrible blow, perhaps even a lethal one. And the apparition of a Chaos Marine confirmed the worst suspicions he and Sylviana had made when interpreting the signs. A black crusade was coming from the Wailing Storm, led by the very fallen angels of the Emperor. And in a single blow, before the hostilities had even truly begun, the forces of the arch-enemy had crippled one of the main forces opposing them. Entire networks of informants and agents were now decapitated, and Alphon greatly doubted all, or even most, of the dead Inquisitors had taken adequate precautions to pass on their assets in case of their own demise. Strangely, despite the lethal nature of their job, most Inquisitors were still reluctant to consider their own mortality, especially when it meant sharing their precious secrets with someone else. Trust was ever in short supply within the Holy Order. "This is a disaster," Alphon whispered to himself. "Quite so," came a voice from the left side of his bed, and Alphon startled as he finally noticed Elydios standing next to him. The Inquisitor was still dressed as he had been during the attack, the only difference being an eye patch of black fabric covering his left eye. "I am glad to see that you woke up." Not many of the others did. The mental attack of that traitor damaged them more deeply than I thought. "How many?" asked the bedded-down Inquisitor to his peer. "Apart from you and me, 7 have already awakened, and we have a dozen still unconscious, though whether or not they will wake up at all is in the Emperor's hands now. I think you will be relieved to know that Sylviana will make it through. Her body was almost completely destroyed, but her brain survived, and the tech priests are confident they can rebuild it to her new specifications. It seems she wants more firepower added to it this time around." "I can understand that," muttered Alphon, indeed feeling a surge of relief at the news. "Me too. Eldon Swen was right, war is coming to Azeroth. It's the only explanation, though it's clear now that the signs on which he acted must have been plants, bait to make him summon the Conclave and use their inside man." He shook his head in disbelief. "I still can't believe none of us caught onto the trap. Emperor's blood, there were more than 70 of us in that room, and none of us saw anything until it was too late." "Powerful backing," replied Alphon, still not trusting himself to speak louder or longer without triggering fits of pain. "Yes," sighed Elydios. "That's the only explanation, isn't it? Whoever is behind all this has access to resources we cannot imagine, because if we could, we would have taken precautions against them. All this paranoia, and it didn't help us a damn. Maybe you can change it. Now you are in charge." "What?" Elydios was startled at Alphon's words, and loomed over him, worry in his eyes, glancing at the machines on the other side of the bed. "Alphon, what are you saying? I thought these things were set to keep you asleep, not make you spout nonsense." "Not nonsense," Alphon forced the words out, finding that they did so more and more easily, as if the mere weight of what he was saying was granting him strength. "The Conclave needs leadership, now more than ever. You fought. You hurt them, forced them to retreat. The last man standing is the one in charge, that's how it works. You are Lord Inquisitor now, or you will be as soon as the rest of us are able to sign the papers and send the communique to Terra." "You can't be serious," argued Elydios stubbornly. "None of the Conclave trust me, and more to the point, they should not. The methods I use are dangerous, Alphon, and I am not gone far enough to not realize how fear of reprisal from other Inquisitors has prevented me from doing some truly stupid things over the years. I can't be in charge of the Conclave when it exists to prevent people like me from going off the deep end like the Horusians." Despite his wounds and the drugs circulating through his bloodstream, the reference to the renegade inquisitorial faction sent a chill down Alphon's spine. That Elydios dared to speak the name of the thrice-cursed was a sign of how shaken he was by Alphon's suggestion. Regardless, he still had a point, but circumstances were too dire to indulge his caution. "To be an Inquisitor," Alphon pronounced as gravely as he could, "is to make the choice between a bad option and the worst one. Azeroth must not fall to chaos, and for that, it needs the Inquisition to stand against the tides of corruption. And for that to happen, the Inquisition needs you." For a moment, Elydios' expression was frozen, as his mind desperately tried to find a way out and failed. Despite the pain, despite the grief, Alphon nearly giggled at the sight, more out of hysteria than genuine humor. Here was a man who had just stood up to a Chaos Sorcerer and an Alpha-class Psyker, scared at the prospect of becoming the leader of the Inquisition in Azeroth. But in spite of his current condition, Alphon was confident in what he had just declared. Radical as he might be, Elydios was still loyal to the Emperor. If anything, his reaction at being proposed leadership of what remained of the Conclave confirmed it beyond doubt. Unless he was a truly exceptional dissembler, His knowledge and power would be invaluable in fighting off these Forsaken Sons to which the Chaos Marine had claimed to belong. The traitor had escaped, after all, and it was likely the Black Crusade, when it came, would have more sorcerers like him in its blasphemous ranks. With Noriov dead, Elidios was one of the last few remaining psychically gifted inquisitors, perhaps the last depending on who had survived the attack. Very well, sighed Elidios, giving up before the inevitable. If you can convince the others to go along with this madness, I will do it. But if you do succeed, I am appointing you as my right hand. I know how much Eldenswen relied on you and trusted you, even if he did an admirable job to keep it secret. If circumstances are dire enough that I must take command, then they are damn well dire enough for you to step out of the shadows and into a more public role. Alphon considered, then nodded. He didn't have much choice, and Elidios was right. It was time for their long alliance to come to the light, though what the surviving inquisitors would make of it, only the Emperor knew. They would need to call upon all the resources of the Inquisition, too. This strike had proved beyond doubt that the foe possessed terrible power, enough to warrant the use of the Ordosh's most secretive and dangerous sanctions. If the traitor legions were involved, then perhaps even the terrible things that had been done during the scouring by the first Inquisitors might be performed once more. Alphon hoped it wouldn't come to that. Purging an entire sector was not something anyone sane would want to be remembered for. Like any Inquisitor, he was loath to relinquish even the smallest of his secrets, but perhaps that was the problem in the Inquisition in the first place. Eldenswen had tried to keep too many secrets, too focused on remaining prepared to face possible future threats to see the one right in front of him. Then again, he couldn't have guessed the true scope of the immediate danger. None of them had, until Gales had revealed his treachery. Perhaps, after seeing the entire Imperium nearly collapse during the War of the Beast, the plots they had uncovered hadn't looked like much to him. Regardless, he was dead now, there was no point pondering his motives, and speaking or thinking ill of the deceased was not just rude, it was bad luck. All right, he accepted. Here is my first recommendation, considering the nature of our enemy, who has both sorcery and Xenos on his side, you should call for the militant arms of the Inquisition. The Imperial Guard and the heirs of Sanguinius must be warned too, of course, but I doubt they alone will be able to stand against the coming invasion. I know, nodded Elidios, his expression now firm and determined. As soon as I find the codes in Eldenswen's chambers, I will send the astropathic summons. He took a deep breath, as if the weight of his new responsibilities was settling on his shoulders, and said, It is time for the Death Watch and the Grey Knights to come to Azeroth. In a Reg of the Wailing Storm. Date unavailable. The flames of the warp finally vanished from Arsim's vision, replaced by the hold of the Hand of Ruin where the Coven had performed the ritual that had sent him and Carthago to the place marked by the trinket of Keralet's spawn. 9 sorcerers stood around the ritual circle, each wearing armor painted black. Behind them were the acolytes whose powers had helped fuel the transfer, men and women whose psychic sparks had marked them for use by their Astartes masters. Sweat, tears and blood stained their robes and the metal floor beneath their feet. Out of the 99 who had been brought at the beginning of the ritual, only about half remained alive, the rest consumed by the sorcerer's demands of them. Their bodies laid on the metal deck, either horribly twisted by the energies they had channeled, or reduced to dry dust. Arsim had expected a worse death count. The 99 humans who had been brought in to assist the ritual were divided in 9 groups, each under the leadership of a wizard, a human psyker who had risen above mere wizards by learning some degree of sorcery and surviving. Of the 9, 6 had come from the feudal world of Elder, and 2 of those, an old man and a younger woman, had been instrumental in the last stages of that planet's conquest. They were also the greatest results of that project, where an entire civilization had been manipulated into producing warriors of all stripes for the Warband, all of which possessing skills and battle experience far above that of the common rabble the Forsaken Sons employed. Even now, years later, Arsim was awed by the scope of Arkan's planning there, and, though he hadn't admitted it out loud, more than a little worried about the exact means by which Arkan had been able to affect Elder years before the Hand of Ruin had reached the planet. The other 3 magi had varied origins. One had been born among the tribes living aboard the Hand of Ruin itself, and had learned the basis of sorcery through the whispers of the demons haunting the ship's dark holds. He had risen to become a petty tyrant until Arsim had humbled him and taken him as a servant of the Coven, where he had been infused with 15th Legion's gene seed by the Fleshmasters. He had survived, becoming one of the few successful hybrids born of Magnus' gene line and gaining psychic abilities that complemented his sorcerous knowledge. Now he wielded power his former tribe would have believed exclusive to their gods, but he was still acutely aware of how inferior he was to his Astartes masters. Another had spent 3 millennia of subjective time manipulating the kings of her birth world, starting wars and ending empires for her own amusement until she had been shown what power truly meant and knelt before the Awakened One, begging to serve him. The survivors of her honor guards still surrounded her, soldiers clad in blue and gold armor marked with the symbol of the god of change and wielding swords and shields, along with the more modern weapons their mistress had secured for them since they had joined the Forsaken Sons. Of the thousands who had once enforced her will, only the 13 present in the room remained, the rest slaughtered by the Awakened One and his Terminators in a direct assault on the sorcerer's castle. And the last had been a sorcerer king, master of an entire world, ruling through his army of terrified servants and twisted, half-living creatures. Young Iams, newest of the coven, had brought him to his elder brothers when he had been reunited with them at the end of the campaign to conquer the Wailing Storm. Arsum had laughed for the first time in what seemed like centuries when the Psychic Unbound had told him how he had forced the little king to submit. He had needed that laugh, especially after what had happened with Lucian. Apparently, the Blade of Terror and its accompanying fleet had spent 3 weeks in orbit, studying the situation. Then Iams had teleported directly into the Sorcerer King's chambers, in the middle of the night, while he was still suffering from the intoxicating effects of the many stimulants he had taken in the evening. While the Unbound had taken care of the ruler's guards, Iams had ripped his way into his target's psyche, greatly diminishing his power, but ensuring his eternal, terrified obedience. In truth, though, none of that really mattered to Arsum, which was why, while he knew their histories and abilities, their names were lost to his memory. The mortals were all tools to him and his brothers, of no consequence so long as they performed adequately. Wids or magi, pure humans or hideous mutants, all it changed was how useful they could be, and how careful he had to be not to break them needlessly. At least none of the magi had died. It was far easier to replace 11 or even 100 wids than it was to find or train a single competent wizard. It still amazed him how much the Warband had gained in the last years, decades, centuries. He did not know how long the conquest of the warp storm had lasted. Any sense of time had been lost in the long journeys through the warp, and the periods he had spent away from his brothers, sent ahead of the Hand of Ruin by sorcery so that he could prepare the way for the Forsaken Sons. He had many fond memories of that time. Civilizations had burned at his will or bowed before him, and he had once spent 20 years directing the construction of a city-sized library that the Warband now used as a repository for all the esoterical texts they had found in the storm. That library had also produced many acolytes for the Coven, scholars of the Forbidden whose minds overflowed with dark lore upon which their masters could draw whenever needed. None of those living repositories of knowledge had psychic powers of their own. The members of the Coven were the only psykers allowed in the Grand Library of Tesseroth. Considering the nature of many of the texts, it was simply too dangerous to do otherwise. Arsum had learned that to his cost when Tesseroth had almost been burned to the ground by a conflict between 2 rival factions among the scholars before he could intervene and kill their leaders, burning them to ash where they stood. A groan at his feet dragged Arsum's thoughts back to the present, and he lowered his gaze. There was Gaeli's Servanters, the pawn of Karalit who had opened the way for him in Carthago. The transition had been unkind to him, though he had clung to Arsum and benefited from some measure of the protective aura the Sorcerer Lord had spread around him. Lacerations covered his skin, the playful caresses of the Neverborn, adding to the wounds he had already sustained in the Inquisition's stronghold. His right eye, the last one made of flesh and not machinery, was gone, replaced by 4 smaller, globular black ones arranged in a diamond shape. Plus, can I play with him? Plus sent Carthago. The Xenos Alpha Psyker was hunched over the prone form of the fallen Inquisitor. Arsum could sense that she was already over their banishment, filing it away in her twisted memory as she focused on new games to play. Or perhaps she had already forgotten completely. It was hard to tell the difference, with her alien and warped thought process. Plus no comma plus Arsum replied. Plus he belongs to Karalit, and I don't want to anger another of the Chosen, not now. We will send him back to the Lord of Ashes when he returns from his assignment. Plus one of the sorcerers approached Arsum, carefully avoiding to look at Carthago. Even after everything the Forsaken Sons had done, the old hatred of the Xenos remained strong in most of the Warband's Astartes. His right shoulder pauldron bore the mark of the chained demon head, the emblem of the Forsaken Sons, while the left still bore the emblem of the legion that had birthed him. Few warriors still did that, many had abandoned their bloodline entirely. But this one still held some measure of affection for the past, as was his right. Arkan had never asked his brothers to paint their armor black, it had simply spread across the warband over time. No one spoke of it out loud, even if everyone saw and thought about what it meant. "Did you succeed?" asked Zarieth, once a librarian of the 17th Legion, reborn as a sorcerer during the Battle of Calth. The other 8 were within hearing distance, and Asim could feel their eagerness for an answer to that same question. He spoke loudly enough to be heard by all. "Yes." The Ez of Malkador were decimated, and the few survivors shocked to their core. Azeroth will be deprived of their leadership in the days to come, just as the Awakened One ordered. "And the other matter?" said the former word-bearer cautiously. "Some things were to be known only to the Chosen, and those whom they trusted above all others." "It is done as well," confirmed the Lord of the Coven. A predatory smile formed beneath his horned helm as he thought of the other thing he had done when facing the Conclave, while they had all been focused on the obvious and very real threat of Carthago tearing them apart with her awesome power. Once more he marveled at Arkan's intricate designs, plots within plots, none of them vital to his goals, all of them sublime and terrifying. It had been the Awakened One who had come up with the plan to cripple the Azeroth Conclave before the war could even truly begin. And he had known Karalit and Asim were the best ones for the job. Working with the Dark Apostle had been a novel experience. But what would result of this collaboration would be worth the discomfort 100 times over. At first, the goal had merely been to destroy the Conclave and deny the Imperium the asset of their knowledge, limited as it might have been. But when Arkan had received the reports from Gailey's interrogation, he had adapted that plan, extending it so that it would have even greater consequences. Today's destruction was only the prelude, a mask to hide the true intent behind Asim and Carthago's journey. Soon, these self-proclaimed guardians of the Forbidden and Watchers of mankind would learn the true depths of their ignorance. Already they surely wept for the dead and the lost, but when the time came, they would scream in horror and despair. It staggered Asim just how much the Imperium had forgotten, how much its self-proclaimed custodians had hidden from themselves and those who would come after them. The Imperium had always been blind. In the beginning, it had been the desire to illuminate the Empire that had driven Augur to rebellion, but this was something else entirely. Though his armor was painted black and his shoulder bore the Warband's emblem, he had expected that they would be able to recognize his armor's design, and know from which legion he had been born. But as he glanced into their minds, he had seen that none of them had any knowledge of the 15th Legion. They had only regarded him as a renegade, a traitor. Did they truly think not knowing about the dangers haunting the galaxy would grant protection from them? And yet, one of them had clearly not believed in those restrictions. One of them had actually possessed some degree of skill in the arts, though he lacked psychic abilities. Had not most of Asim's power been dealing with the other matter, he was confident he could have dispelled the banishment spell the Inquisitor had cast. But with things as they were, it was all he had been able to do to complete his task before he, Carthago, and Karalit's pawn had been sent back. Regardless, the Inquisitor had the potential to become dangerous for the Warband's plans, especially if he let go of the few restraints he still had, a likely reaction in the aftermath of his peers' massacre. Asim would need to warn Arkan about that Inquisitor, see what could be learned of him from the intel the Renegade's interrogation had given them. He was glad Arkan had bestowed the task of dealing with the Conclave upon him. The mere existence of the Inquisition was offensive to him, a hideous echo of mankind's most primitive, hate-filled days, when willful ignorance and self-blinding to the truths of the universe had ruled supreme. Simply by allowing its creation, the false emperor had proven that those the Imperium called traitors had been right to rebel against him. How many cities had burned at the hands of those he and Carthago had slain today? How many worlds, reduced to ash not for conquest or to punish rebellion, but simply to hide the truth? 179 cities, came the answer from deep within him. 6 inhabited worlds. Would you like to know why they died? Asim ignored the voice of the Herald of Blood. In the years he had spent in the Wailing Storm, he had never found a way to end his connection to the creature. His best hope, the former assassin Balthazar, had died to free Carthago of her prison. He had made no deal through the demon since that day, though he was bitterly certain that he would, if Arkan demanded it of him. Mercifully, Its offers had grown less frequent since Carthago had been released and had begun to stay in his presence more and more often. He did not think he could have dealt with the two of them at once. "Send the thralls back to their quarters," he ordered Zarieth, before tilting his head toward Gales and adding, "and take care of this one. I may need to question him later, and we will return him to Karalit when the Lord of Ashes returned to us in any case." How long was I gone? The question made sense, though he had only been absent for a few minutes from his perspective. Time was often distorted whenever the warp was involved, something the Forsaken Sons had made great use of during their campaign of conquest in the Wailing Storm. Zarieth's response confirmed that this had been the case this time too. The circle had kept the spell powered for more than an hour before the Sorcerer Lord had returned. "Then I better go to Archon," he declared. "He and the other Chosen will await my report." The sorcerer bowed, and Arsum started to walk toward the room's exit. He could feel the awed gazes directed at him, who was one of the Chosen, one of the few who dared to speak Archon's name rather than any of his plethora of titles. That, too, wasn't something Archon had commanded, or even a rule ever spoken aloud. It was just something that had happened after the Warband had gathered, heeding the call of its master after years spent wandering the Wailing Storm, bringing demon worlds to heal. When the Forsaken Sons had come together again, their conquered legions had come with them, seeing each other for the first time. For all those who had not been part of Archon's own splinter of the Warband, it had been the first time they had been within the same system as the one who ultimately owned them. Many rumors and legends circulated through the lower ranks of the Warband about the Awakened One, some of them rooted in truth, others nothing more than mad fancies, and others, the ones Arsum was most wary of, signs of what the former son of Horus might yet accomplish and become. Carthago floated next to him, looking at everything around them like a child in a toymaker's shop, occasional giggling in his mind when she glimpsed something she found amusing. He had long since given up trying to figure out just what criteria she used for that, even longer than had passed since he had begun to think of the Xenos as a she rather than an it. In the grand scheme of things, he had found, some hatreds simply weren't worth the effort to cling on to them. His hatred of the Imperium was more than enough for him, and Carthago shared it. In fact, hers was possibly even greater than his own. Behind her childish facade lurked a darkness that whispered in the hearts of all aboard the Hand of Ruin, and even beyond the limits of the Wailing Storm. Arsum knew the source of that hatred, knew that it went beyond what the Sisters of Silence had done to her. He remembered ancient texts he had read in Tizca, histories from mankind's distant, all but forgotten past. He knew what the name Carthago meant, and the implications still disturbed him whenever he thought on them. Once more, Arsum turned his mind away from such considerations. The holds of the Hand of Ruin were packed to the brim with slave warriors from all across the Wailing Storm. Hundreds of thousands of them, living in smaller warbands and fighting each other for glory and the favor of their transhuman masters. As long as they did not impede the working of the ship itself, the Forsaken Sons left them to their own devices, some of them looking upon the battles with amusement and interest, selecting those who displayed unusual cunning or strength and making them their own agents. The Fleshmasters were among those, always seeking new subjects for their experiments, and releasing their successors back to observe them in this environment. The humans told tales between themselves of the lords who took the worthies and transformed them into greater beings. These legends were encouraged by the Fleshmasters. It made their subjects less likely to run away when they realized the truth of the enhancement protocols and their dangers. Arsum passed thousands of these slaves on his way to the Stratageum. All of them prostrated themselves at his approach, recognizing the mark of his power if not his identity. He could feel their terror, their awe, their envy, and their hate. Most of it was directed to the Xenos that floated at his side, but he wasn't foolish enough to believe that none of it was aimed at it as well. Many knew him, knew what he had done to their worlds. Others just hated him because he was above them, and they could not tolerate it. They wanted to be like him, one of the Chosen who sat at Archon's councils and spoke with his authority. Once, the Chosen had been an informal group. During the Paraxis campaign, there had been those few who had been given tasks from the Awakened One himself, and none had dared to go against them. But that had been at a time when the Astartes still made up the bulk of the Warband's forces, and all of their mortal servants were subservient to all transhuman warriors. Now, there were simply too many disparate groups united under the banner of the chained demon head. Astartes were still feared and obeyed, as was proper, but not all could give commands to the mortal lords of the gathered armies. The Chosen were Archon's warlords, the Lords of Lords, each wielding tremendous power both in their own and through those they commanded. Some of them would remain with Arkan, helping him as Asim had just done. Others, mainly those who had led their own forces in the conquest of the Wailing Storm, would direct the separate fleets and armies once the Warband's forces splintered again over the course of the Black Crusade. Black Crusade. Another term that should be unfamiliar, yet felt to Asim as if he had always known what it meant. Arkan had shared little of his sorcerous communion with Abaddon, the former first captain of the 16th Legion, but Asim had his own ears in the warp. He knew what Abaddon had become, and what he had done. It felt strange to think of another being than Horus Lupercal as Warmaster, but time changed all things. Just like Abaddon had unified the forces of the Eye of Terror and inflicted great destruction upon the Imperium, so would the Forsaken Sons do with the Wailing Storm and the Azeroth sector. It would be on a smaller scale to be sure, but it wouldn't look like it to those caught in it, of that Asim was certain. Arkan had less legionaries under his command than the Warmaster, but the armies of the Wailing Storm still numbered in the millions, and they had many warriors in their ranks who, while not the equals of Space Marines, were still powerful in their own right. The former explorers of Eldar were but one such group. Outside the hull of the Hand of Ruin, an entire armada of troop carriers awaited their orders, each equally full. The defenders of the Azeroth sector would weep when they realized the scale of the threat that was about to be unleashed upon them. Only a being of immense will and power could keep such a force united, however, and that being was the one Asim was going to meet, in the Hand of Ruin's stratagem. Deep within the flagship's hull, the stratagem was one of the most heavily guarded sections of the vessel. Only legionaries with important business, or the chosen themselves, were allowed in by the Terminators who guarded the entrance. These warriors were Arkan's own bodyguards, all of whom had sworn to lay down their life before allowing harm to come to their liege lord. Since the completion of the Wailing Storm's conquest, Arkan had spent almost all of his time in the stratagem, and therefore his bodyguards had spent most of theirs guarding it. Recognizing Asim, they let him pass with a respectful nod, and a glare toward Carthago. Once, they had tried to prevent the Xenos Psyker from accompanying the Sorcerer Lord. That was a mistake they would not make again. No one had died, but it had been a very close thing. In the center of the stratagem throned the Hindsight's Might. The device had been heavily modified of late. Its cogitating power increased dramatically so that it was able to simulate several battle zones at once, and even avoid conflicts. At the moment, it was projecting an abstract representation of the Azeroth sector, with data about each planet's defenses hovering in the air next to the symbol depicting the world itself. Intelligence had been gathered by Decaro's infiltration efforts and a few careful scouting missions of the Warband's first targets. Arkan had used that information to simulate the campaign hundreds, perhaps thousands of times, searching for the optimal deployment, sometimes adding data to the simulation that made no sense but that he seemed to think was necessary. The rest of the stratagem's personnel, a mix of dark magi, crew members fused to their stations and mutated humans whose brains were living data repositories, worked as silently as possible, unwilling to disturb their master's thoughts. Runes were inscribed on nearly every surface of the stratagem. Every member of the Coven had worked upon them, shedding his blood to fuel their power. Together, they turned the room into a nexus of etheric energies, a chamber of power unlike any other in the entire fleet. Even the Coven's ritual chambers had not had so much effort gone into them. It had been the Awakened One's will that this be done, though, and so the Coven had obeyed. Looking at the enthroned form of Arkan, sitting on the other side of the Hindsight's Might's display, Asim could see why. Arkan sat in unnatural shadows, on a throne that had once been a mere seat of metal, but had grown bony protrusions over the course of the journey through the Wailing Storm. It now looked as if Arkan was sitting within the maw of some immense sea beast, like a conqueror on a feral world who had turned the corpse of his greatest prize into a symbol of his power. His eyes glazed in the gloom, a pale unlight that made the veins of red crystal running on the warlord's face glow. Yet it was in Asim's second sight that Arkan looked most dangerous. The power of the warp was seeping into his soul, channeled through the entire ship by the runes of the Covenant directly into his flesh. The throne of bone and metal was at the center of the etheric alignment, and its effects on the spirit of the Awakened One were profound. Any lesser being would have been consumed by the currents long ago, their will unable to hold their body together under such a strain. But Arkan had not just survived, he had thrived, becoming less and less mortal as the conquest advanced. The physical changes in his face were but the most obvious of the transformations he had undergone. It was strange, and more than a little disquieting, in Asim's opinion. In the past, Arkan had expressed nothing but disdain for those who courted the Dark God's ultimate blessing, yet now he seemed well on his way to having it bestowed upon him. The Sorcerer Lord knew why his master thought it necessary to increase his personal might in such a manner, yet his doubts lingered. Had the Awakened reached this conclusion of his own and changed his mind, or had it been changed for him, as the power's hold on his soul grew ever stronger? He is changing, Asim thought. We are all changing, reshaping ourselves in the fires of our hate, defining who we are by what we dream of destroying. Many of those we regard as slaves look up to us as gods, and from their point of view, we might as well be. What will we become, in the end? Strong, came the voice of the Herald of Blood. You will become the instruments of the Imperium's destruction, and wield power such as you couldn't even dream of when you were still blinded by the anathema's lies. Such power cannot come without sacrifice, Father. Arkan, Asim called out to his brother, breaking the silence of the stratagem and turning his thoughts away from the demon's unsettling prophecy. Your will has been done. The Azarok conclave is crippled, and the seeds of their world's complete doom have been sown. Karalet's agent performed well, and I brought him back with us. On his throne at the end of the stratagem, the Awakened One stirred from his contemplation of the Hindsight's Might's hololithic projection, his body emerging from the shadows and becoming visible to Asim's mundane sight. The Lord of the Forsaken Suns wore the Terminator warplate that had been more or less fused to his body since the wounds he had taken fighting the demon prince Serexithar on Paraxis, with vicious-looking lightning claws ending each of his arms. At the moment, the blades were depowered, but still sharp enough to tear through flesh and bone with ease. His chest plate bore the image of the chained demon head, though the sculpted Neverborn was shown screaming in agony, the chains biting deep into its flesh. Asim recognized the demon, too. It was the bird-like face of Serexithar. Sometimes, Asim fancied that he could see the face move, and that the demon prince could see through it from its eternal torment on Paraxis, where Arkan had bound its essence to serve as the anchor that kept the wailing storm in existence. The light of the hololithic projection shone on the crystals threading Arkan's skin, making him look like a blood-drenched spectre only halfway returned from death. Next to Asim, Carthago went silent, as she always did when in Arkan's presence. You speak truly, said the Awakened One, and yet, I hear uncertainty in your words, brother. Why is that? What happened on Chemairos that we did not anticipate? There was one of the Inquisitors who didn't die. You asked that I ensure not all of them perished, but there was no need for deception. One of them had the skills to turn the ritual that brought me and Carthago there against us, and he sent us back here. While his actions prevented the risk of our enemies divining our intent from my holding back, he might be a problem later down the line. I think we should make sure he does not survive to see our plan reach fruition. For you to speak so highly of his skills, that man must be remarkable indeed, remarked Arkan, not appearing fazed in the least by the sorcerer's announcement. Very well. When we make contact with our allies in Azarok, you will contact them and arrange for this to be taken care of. We cannot hope to control the flow of the Black Crusade completely, it would be folly to even try, but we can and shall do our best to limit the number of unforeseen variables at play. Decaros will be the best to call upon, I think. But it will be some time before we are in a position to contact him and corral it again, I fear. In the meantime, you will have to extract all the information the renegade can tell you about this particular Inquisitor, and make your own plans for dealing with him. For a few seconds, Arkan closed his eyes, his aura flaring with images of armies and fleets moving through the stars as he considered the Warband's course of action. When he opened them again, his expression was set and firm, and he looked at the Hindsight's Might with absolute focus. Now, the time has come. All of our preparations are complete at last. Arkan took a deep breath before continuing, the sound like the wailing of lost souls. He turned toward one of the attendants, and commanded, call all of the Chosen in the fleet. They are to come here at once. Never before had the Chosen gathered in such number. Save for Karalit and Decaros, whose missions still kept them in Imperial territory, all members of this dreadful brotherhood were present in one way or another. They circled the hololithic table, filling the empty space between it and the cogitators and their attendants. Only those who were physically bound to their stations remained in the room, the rest having departed long ago. The mutated, cybernetically enhanced wretches kept even quieter than when Arkan had been meditating, if that were possible. Arsam stood at Arkan's left side, and Damarian, the chief of the Awakened One's bodyguards, at his right, their places marking their positions as the most favored seconds of their lord. Carthago hovered at his back, her thin arms draped over his shoulders and around his throat as she peered at the assembled worthies. Those gathered here were all smart enough not to take offense at her presence, bearing her gaze with uneasy grace, even if none of them could quite suppress a shiver whenever she giggled while looking at them. Well, none save for Arkan and one other, who sat directly opposite. Farther from the throne of power, both physically and metaphorically, was Mikhail Kashinenko. The hybrid of Fulgrim's gene seed was the most diminutive of the chosen, but, Arsam knew, not the weakest. When before he had been but a servant of his better, the devotee of Slansh had been transformed, transfigured even, by his trials in the Wailing Storm. The degeneration that had been poised to claim his life had been cured by the dark arts of the Shai-Ilat, but that salvation had come at an unexpected cost. While he slumbered in the altering tanks of the Gene Lord who had promised to save him, his right hand had been removed and replaced with a piece of dark tech from the Age of Strife. The hybrid had used the relic as payment for his cure, but the Shai-Ilat had returned it, for its desire to see the artifact used was greater than that of ownership. Power blazed from the crystalline matrix embedded in the augmetic, coursing through the rest of the artificial limb and into the rest of Mikhail's body. The seed of ruin that had been sown within the mortal's soul long ago, before the Forsaken Sons had come to Paraxis and gathered those there who served the dark gods, was growing stronger with every passing week, feeding on the energies of the device. Mikhail was a symbol among the slave caste of the Forsaken Sons. His story, grossly inflated to suit the hybrid's ego, was spread throughout the fleet, telling of how a simple human had risen to the heights of power, infused with the gene seed of the Astartes lords and augmented even further by the graft of his new hand. He was living proof that, among the Forsaken Sons, anyone could rise to power, if they proved worthy. Playing on that reputation, Mikhail had amassed a great following among the Warband's mortal servants, especially within those who, like him, served the Dark Prince. His ship, the Bite of Darkness, had once belonged to a rogue trader who had been trapped in the Wailing Storm when it had erupted, and was now packed to the brim with tens of thousands of cultists with various levels of martial skills. Rumor had it that the rogue trader still lived, kept a prisoner within what had been her own personal quarters and were now Mikhail's private chambers. Next to the Slayer Ineshi 3rd Legion hybrid was the only Xenos besides Carthago whose presence was allowed in the room. Ezerthin, firstborn of the Shai-Ilat, who had left his domain of Paraxis to join in the coming crusade. As the firstborn stood silent, he could be mistaken for a normal Eldar, only his black eyes and the pallor of his skin betrayed the corruption writhing within him. He did not wear his suit of living armor, but leathery clothes fashioned from the skin of gene-spliced human slaves. Their varied coloration, from pink to crimson to blue and green, was entirely natural, the product of careful genetic tailoring in the cloning facilities of the Gene Lords on Paraxis. Ezerthin also appeared to be unharmed, but that did little to curtail the looks of distrust the other chosen sent in his direction. They all knew that he was far from harmless. One did not keep supreme command over a group such as the Shai-Ilat without a few tricks up one's sleeve. Since the Forsaken Sons had departed Paraxis and left it in the hands of their regent, the Shai-Ilat had risen in power among the factions there. Nelimos, the ruined hive city Arkan had offered to Slansh, had been rebuilt into an image of what the system had been when the Shai-Ilat had held sway over it, before the Great Crusade. When the rulers of Paraxis had been called upon, as per the accords they had signed, Ezerthin had led the contingent the various factions had provided. New ships had been built in Paraxis orbital facilities, including several of the Shai-Ilat's own designs, twisted things whose mere appearance exposed the soul to the caress of Slansh. Right now, Fleshmaster Jacaerys was aboard the flagship of this dreadful flotilla, helping the Shai-Ilat witches bring new members of their species back from the Dark Prince's court. There were rumors of an Eldar presence in the Azeroth sector, though even Dekaros had been unable to obtain confirmation. If the children of Aisha were truly there, and Arkan had told Arsam he expected their involvement in any case, the Shai-Ilat would be the Warband's best weapon against them. Completing the trio of Slayer Ineshi at the gathering was Orpheus, son of Fulgrim, member of the Coven and the appointed leader of the Warband's splinter which had contained the Dark Prince's devotees. Orpheus' armor had been thoroughly desecrated, all signs of his erstwhile allegiance to the Imperium removed or defiled. The Aquila still shone on his breastplate, but the two heads of the eagle had been removed as if the bird had been decapitated, rubies playing the part of spraying blood droplets. Screaming faces carved in silver decorated the armor, their empty eye sockets seeming to glow with the light of captive spirits. The sorcerer still wore his psychic hood, though it had been warped into some manner of dark crown that dug into his temples and pumped a strange, black liquid directly into his brain. A pair of bear power swords hung at his waist, the only pieces of equipment that had not been marked. The weapons still bore the emblems of the 1st and 7th Legions, from which had hailed the champions on whose corpses Orpheus had claimed them. Despite the selfish and arrogant nature of all champions of Slange, Orpheus had managed to keep the forces under his command from falling apart, even when Mikhail had risen to prominence. He had kept the balance between the different groups, keeping internal bloodshed to a minimum, though he had not even attempted to suppress it completely. His flagship, the Oblivion's Keeper, was now home to warrior cults and other cultists of the Dark Prince, an elite force compared to the masses of corrupted humanity under Mikhail's command. Noise Marines, Raptors, and other Astartes who bore the mark of the youngest god had also gathered under his leadership, unwilling to follow an upstart mortal like Mikhail, no matter how powerful he might have become. The armed forces under his command and his gift for diplomacy among those who shared his faith were the reasons for which he had become one of the chosen, despite no longer being in actual, direct control of all the forces Archon had entrusted to him. Youngest of all the chosen, younger even than the half-mortal Mikhail, was Malone, Lord of the Unbound. The vagaries of warp travel had likely made that assertion irrelevant, but it didn't stop the other chosen from regarding Malone as such. Regardless of how long he had lived, he had been born long after everyone else, harvested from the Mueller system and turned into an Unbound in a Hand of Ruins halls. When Lucian, Archon's appointed commander of the Warband splinter that had held the Fleshmaster's first and greatest creations, had succumbed to the call of a possessed blade, Malone had defeated and imprisoned him, before taking command. In the years that followed, he had led the forces under his command to victory after victory, gathering an impressive host behind him when the call of the Awakened One had come and all Forsaken Sons had been drawn to the edge of the storm their master had unleashed, what seemed an eternity ago. Malone had hoped, or so he claimed, that the Coven would be able to free his possessed lord, but by the time the battle group had reunited with the rest of the Warband, it had been too late. The sorcerers had tried their best, but the claws of the Slayer Ineshi demon were too deep in Lucian's soul. Any attempt at exorcism would only result in the warrior's demise. Still, there had been talk of killing Lucian and release him from this bondage, but Archon had overruled it. So much was the Astartes in the demon's hold that death would bring him no release from his torment, and at least he could still serve the Warband, now that the Coven had applied the proper bindings upon both his body and the infernal blade that held him in thrall. Chained within the Blade of Terror, Malone's flagship, Lucian had become another weapon in the Warband's arsenal, the demon controlling him too prideful and mighty to allow free roaming. Malone had come to the gathering alone, as commanded, but it felt strange to Arsum to see him so. The Lord of the Unbound was rarely without some counsel at his side, his kinsman Igdal, the young sorcerer Iams, or even the Fleshmaster Jacaerus and the Ascended, Jerib. Some whispered this was because Malone lacked confidence and power deserving of a chosen, but Arsum had seen in his soul, and he knew better. Malone cut an imposing figure in his black and gold armor, his face hidden beneath his helmet. The same people who questioned his worth saw it as a further sign of weakness, a pathetic attempt at concealing his youth from sight. But again, Arsum knew better. He had sensed the mark upon Malone's soul and flesh, a secret that he had kept. A sword and pistol hung from his belt, both prizes he had taken from slain foes during the conquest of the Wailing Storm. His gaze slowly moved from one member of the assembly to the next, never stopping long enough that it could be taken as a challenge, yet Arsum could feel that the Lord of the Unbound wasn't looking at those present in the room, he was looking at something only he could see. His aura flickered with glimpses of the memories and dreams he was contemplating. The Unfettered was one of the chosen not present in person, instead taking part in the meeting through a hololithic projection. Ever since the reunion of the Forsaken Sons and his elevation to the Circle of Archon's lieutenants, the Fleshmaster had kept to the ship the Awakened One had given to him, the Truthful Gate. The Truthful Gate was a medical and laboratory ship, once a frigate of the Imperial Army dedicated to the study and treatment of the countless diseases and afflictions that infested the galaxy. Now, it was the Unfettered's personal lab, filled to the brim with the deluded faithful of a ruined hive world whose prophets had foretold the coming of the Forsaken Sons for generations. Amidst the desolation of their world, these genetically pure humans had waited for the coming of their gods, who prophecy claimed would elevate them and free them of mortality. This made them eager volunteers for the Unfettered's research into infernal transubstantiation. The members of the Coven stayed clear of the Truthful Gate. The warp around the ship was constantly fluctuating with spikes of tormented power and joyous agony in rhythm with the experiments. Arsene was glad the Unfettered wasn't here in person. The obsession of the former word-bearer with claiming the immortality that the gods had promised to mankind was unsettling to say the least. At Arkane's command, a handful of members of the Coven had gone over to the Truthful Gate to assist the Unfettered in his experiments, and what they had told Arsene was dreadful even to him. But the Awakened One had given his blessing to the endeavor, and therefore it would continue. While the Unfettered was only present through hololithic projection because his experiments couldn't be left alone for long, Paranefer had to resort to such means because his body wouldn't have fit at the table. The real body of the Infernus dreadnought was still aboard the Crystalline, connected to streams of cable that allowed the corpse-like son of Magnus interred within to watch the other Chosen directly, without the need for actual hololithic projections on his end of the connection. The hololithic projection only showed the centerpiece of his massive body, the ornate sarcophagus in which Paranefer's physical remains were interred. The Dark Mechanicum adepts whose forces constituted the bulk of the Chosen's armies had honored their master by reworking on his frame tirelessly, and the sarcophagus now displayed an image of Paranefer as he had been in life, wearing his armor and surrounded by icons of the Eightfold Omnissiah. When Paranefer's fleet had arrived at the mustering, there had been much surprise across the Warband. After the events of Paraxis, many had believed that Paranefer's assignment was a thinly disguised death sentence. For what hope could one small ship and a handful of legionaries have to conquer a Forge world? Yet the Infernus dreadnought had returned with the largest armada, save that gathered by Arkane himself, and his place among the Chosen had been unquestionable. The Dark Magi of Argenta Primus and their Scutari legions had conquered many systems, reaping a harvest of flesh that had gone through varied augmentation processes to increase their numbers. Some worlds had been left bare in their wake, while others had been uplifted to new technological levels, though their people most likely didn't appreciate the changes to their planet. Several worlds which were particularly rich in natural resources were even in the process of being turned into Forge worlds of their own, a process that would take years but would provide the Warband with a reliable supply of material further down the line. All in all, Arsene thought, a fitting atonement for the near disaster at Paraxis that Paranefer's meddling in Primarch cloning had almost brought upon them all. Arkane's decision to turn the near-dead sorcerer into a dreadnought had certainly been justified. The same couldn't be said for the last attendant, one whose inclusion in the ranks of the Chosen still baffled Arsene. Hector Hecaran, the Blood Champion, was only here as a sorceress projection, an echo of his warp presence manifested by a ritual circle inscribed onto the stratageum's floor for that precise purpose. The possessed was still held within a hold of the Hand of Ruin, locked away from the rest of the ship. Of course, his power couldn't be denied. Over the course of the Wailing Storm's conquest, it had grown just as Hector's humanity had diminished. Even the Coven's wards couldn't contain his aura completely, and the section of the ship surrounding his extensive cell were the lair of the most blood-crazed of all the Forsaken Sons and their slaves. But ever since the last battle of Paraxis, the Blood Champion had been little more than a living weapon, barely coherent most of the time even when outside of battle. Though he wouldn't say so out loud, Arsene thought that Hector had truly become the living image of his Primarch. The Sorcerer Lord needed to shield his thoughts from just what emanated from the projection, lest images of slaughter fill his mind. Yet still Arkane had named Hector one of his Chosen, and had not answered Arsene's questions about it, nor, to the Sorcerer Lord's knowledge, those of anyone else. Eventually, Arsene had figured that it had probably something to do with one of the Awakened One's secret plans, and resolved to wait and see it reach fruition. Perhaps it was so that the Blood God would have a representative at the council? But if that were the case, then why had none of the Plague God's servants been similarly elevated? A small plague fleet accompanied the Forsaken Sons' armada, vessels of rusted metal and cancerous flesh aboard which the followers of Nurgle were more or less quarantined for the protection of the rest of the Warband. The Plague Marines of the Warband ruled the mutants and cultists who crowded these vessels, along with Neverborn bred from the surrounding sickness. For a long time Arsene had expected Betronicus, who led the former Death Guards, to become one of the Chosen, yet that had not happened. Though Arsum had nothing but contempt for the Lord of Decay's ideology of surrender, part of him worried that Archon might draw his ire for this. At least the Blood Champion wouldn't plot for his own advancement in the eyes of Archon, or against the other chosen. Though the Warband had only been gathered for a few weeks, there had already been several moments when they had come close to open warfare. The pull of opposing dark gods was strong, and without an enemy to fight, the armies of the Forsaken Sons would eventually begin to fight. The legionaries who had undergone the Exodus together wouldn't turn upon each other, but the Unbound's discipline was less certain. Truly, it was time for the Black Crusade to begin, before they did the Imperials' work for them. The hindsights might have been configured to display the border between the Wailing Storm and the Azeroth sector, as well as much of the latter's systems. It showed the known warp routes as well, connecting stars like blood vessels, allowing the Imperium's isolated worlds to rely upon one another for countless supplies. One world of the border in particular was surrounded by far more information than the rest, and, at a silent command from Archon, the projection zoomed in on the planet, showing an orb of poison seas and vast, dry plains. All of the Chosen were looking at it, but it was Archon who spoke its name, like a judge announcing the death sentence of a criminal. Silberstart, he breathed, the name echoing in the Stratageum silence. Sentinel of the Abyssian Marches, guardian world of Azeroth against any threat rising from the Wailing Storm. After the Orcs ravaged it during the War of the Beast, it was remade into its current form as part of the Imperium's rebuilding process. Millions of Imperial Guardsmen are stationed there, along with a base for Battlefleet Azeroth and an Adeptus Mechanicus contingent. For nearly 200 years, its forces have kept the subsector pacified, crushing any rebellion that might be stirred by the influence of the storm and keeping the trade routes safe from piracy coming from the wild regions of space. The Chosen stirred at the words of their lord. For all their differences, they were all of them warriors, who were only truly in their place when they were fighting, and Silberstart looked like it would be a great battlefield indeed. They had faced challenges in the Wailing Storm, though none as difficult as their war against the Sons of Kalth and the remnants of Imperial forces that had gathered at Paraxis. There had even been a few actual wars, where the smaller splinters had spent years of relative time conquering a single system or even planet. But Silberstart, that would be a different matter entirely. Though most of them had already studied the worlds of Azeroth, they still hung on to Archon's words eagerly. The world stands at a crossroads of warp routes that allow swift navigation to all other worlds of the Abyssian Marches, continued the Awakened One, including a channel leading deeper into the Azeroth sector. The planet's moon has been taken over by the Administratum and turned into a hub of trade and logistics, monitoring the flow of resources through the subsector and to the rest of Azeroth. Hundreds of merchant vessels pass through the system every day, their authorizations checked by the drones of the Administratum before they can continue their journey. This, my brothers, will be our first target. Even now, the Imperials gather their forces, warned of our coming by the signs we have sown, but their pathetic attempt at stopping us will fail. We will burn this world to the ground, and its fall shall send a message to the slaves of the Corpse Emperor throughout the entire sector. All will know that not even their best warriors can stand against our might. Fear and despair will spread, weakening the rest of the sector's worlds long before our fleets darken their skies. Here, we will light the spark of the inferno that will consume the entire Azeroth sector, and from the ashes shall rise the doom of the Imperium itself. Return to your ships, declared Archon, rising from his throne and gesturing with his claws as if to stab through the projected image of the Azeroth sector, and prepare for warp transit. Today, the Forsaken Sons go to war. Death to the false Emperor. Death to the false Emperor, roared back the Chosen. The fleet of the Forsaken Sons had gathered in a system that had been at the edge of the Trebadius sector, in the time before Archon had unleashed the power contained at Ilias and created the Wailing Storm. The single inhabitable planet had been scourged clean of life by the Aetheriquins, leaving behind nothing but warped cities and statues of crystal and stone depicting the last horrified moments of the few millions who had called the world home. After the Chosen had made the trip back to their own flagships, the fleet began to move toward the edge of the system, right at the sea of eldritch energies that had drowned the Trebadius sector. Across the fleet, crew members who realized what they were about to do were filled with cold dread. Navigation from one point of the Wailing Storm to another was difficult, but breaking through the tides of chaos and emerge back into reality was all but impossible. No Gellerfield or Sorcerer Sword would be powerful enough to keep the raging storms from ripping the fleet apart. In their sealed chambers, the navigators, both those who had accompanied the Forsaken Sons since the flight from Terra, those captured since, and those who did not bear the third eye but used other, less elegant means to guide a ship through the warp, trembled. They had received only the simplest of instructions from the Hand of Ruin, to lock onto the Warband's mighty flagship and follow its course through the Sea of Souls. The 12 kilometers long vessel was leading the fleet, and looked to be about to sail directly into the near-solid wall of warp energy. Then, it happened. In one of the spires of the Hand of Ruin, whose access was forbidden to all but Arkan himself, the Awakened One stood before a viewing bay, staring through the reinforced window and at the swirling tides beyond. Around him were relics collected during the conquest of the Wailing Storm, artifacts so dangerous that he had kept their very existence secret from the rest of the Warband. There was the genetic code of the Children of Woe, all of Paranefa's research compiled in a single data slate that was more heavily encrypted than the secrets of a High Lord of Terror. Atop an altar made of black stone was a primitive knife of bone engraved with runes that glowed softly with the power of the greater demon bound within the ritual blade, while a simple, featureless white mask hid ancient technology that would kill anyone who put the mask on and replace their personality with that of the insane techno-warlord uploaded inside its cogitators. There were many more of these relics, yet none were more dangerous than the one who had gathered them all. As he looked into the Wailing Storm, Arkan felt its claws reach toward his soul. For all that he had created the warp storm and was responsible for its continued existence through the anchoring, the primitive, bestial sentience of the Wailing Storm still sought to tear his soul apart. But it would find no weakness in the fortress of his will. Instead, it would submit to him, though not without cost. Long had the Lord of the Forsaken Sons planned for this moment, having known it would come from the very moment he had unleashed the power of Ilia's dead. As the Word-Bearer's abandoned weapon had been activated, he had known that one day he would need to depart the Wailing Storm in order to continue to prosecute his war against the Imperium. And so, he had prepared, bending his every effort toward uncovering a path out of his creation while the rest of the Warband went on to the business of conquering what the Trebedius sector had become. But he had found nothing. The Wailing Storm's borders could be broken by small, individual vessels, Decaros and Karalit had left in this manner. But there was no path stable and large enough for a fleet to go through. When he had realized the trap in which he had fallen, the cruel machinations of the ruinous powers revealing themselves to him in a supreme moment of clarity, he had nearly gone mad. When the first War Master had learned the primordial truth and shared it with his legion, Arkan had seen the Dark Gods for what they were, great powers that could be used in the war against the false Emperor, allies whose help came at a cost that the rebels had to be willing to pay in order to challenge the might of the self-proclaimed master of mankind. He had used them in the Parasksis campaign, making the offerings that had anchored the Wailing Storm into existence so that the Forsaken Sons would have the time to conquer it all. Now, the Warband had gathered an army bred on 100 worlds, but it was useless to the long war if it was trapped within the Wailing Storm. Arkan had not considered himself a servant of the Dark Gods, but he had no choice but to become one now. He must walk the path to glory, which led only to death, spawnhood, or transfiguration into one of the Neverborn. This was the price he had to pay in order to continue his war. No true mortal could command to the Sea of Souls, only the gods could do that. And the gods would not grant him this boon unless he willingly and completely dedicated himself to their cause. After all, true power only ever came through sacrifice, and real sacrifice was that of the self. That had been the subject of much of his discussion with the new War Master, though Abaddon did not walk the same path. That was some consolation to Arkan. At least, there would be someone to bring about the Imperium's destruction once his story ended and the powers came for him. With a scream of anger, hatred, and deeply buried sorrow, Arkan the Awakened One, champion of Chaos Undivided, ripped the space before him with his claws. The power of the warp and the blessings of the gods that coursed through him channeled his intent, and the wall of etheric storms parted before the Hand of Ruin, allowing passage through the edge of the Wailing Storm. Location unknown. 743 M32. Darkness surrounded him. Its cold embrace blanketed his mind, silencing his thoughts. Even the beating of his heart had succumbed to the all-encompassing quiet. Was he dead, then? Was this infinite blackness death? He felt there should be more. Plus awakening of the machine spirit plus initiating encephalic connection plus scanning of the frontal lobe plus vestigial activity confirmed plus begin resurrection protocols plus Chapter Master, can you hear me? A voice pierced the dark, shattering the silence. With it came a renewed awareness, and with that awareness came pain. Agony ran through every fiber of his being, a million fangs tearing at him as the ruin that was his flesh reminded him of its existence. Chapter Master Ragwell, said the voice. It was insistent, now. What did it want? Why had it disturbed his peaceful death? I know you can hear me, but you must listen. There is little time. Ragwell, he knew that name. Was it his? Yes it was. Ragwell Alistors, Chapter Master of the heirs of Sanguinius. The name was his, and the other words were important too, even if he could not remember their meaning. Focus, Chapter Master, the voice urged on. Think back on what happened before. You must remember what happened on Silberstadt. That word, Silberstadt, he knew it too. Hearing it brought pain, and anger, and sorrow, stabbing at his consciousness without mercy, bringing torment worse than even the pain of being. You must remember, the voice insisted. Your duty demands it. We must know what happened if we are to stop the heretics' attack on the Emperor's dominion. The mention of the Emperor triggered his fragmented memory. In flashes of images and sounds, he remembered what had happened. He stood on the bridge of the Blade of Righteousness, watching Silberstadt grow in the primary oculus as the ship returned from her patrol the system's edge. For now, the world was barely more than a speck, but Ragwell's mind could easily conjure the details from memory. The fortress world was a grey pearl, its many towers and keeps shining with the light of the system's pale star. The only difference with his previous visit to the system was the number of ships orbiting Silberstadt and patrolling the system looking for any sign of the enemy they had been gathered here to fight. Of course, the differences with Ragwell's first visit to the system were much more pronounced, as were those of the chapter master himself. When he had first journeyed to Silberstadt, more than 200 years ago, it had been aboard a battered and limping Imperial Navy cruiser, reclaimed from the Orcs and sent to purge the last of the Greenskins' presence in Azeroth by taking part in the burning of the system's soul world to the ground. The ship had been put out of commission mere months afterwards. By contrast, the battle barge of the heirs of Sanguinius was a mighty vessel, born in the shipyards of distant and hallowed Mars and bearing the silver and red that formed the chapter's colors. It had been gifted to the chapter upon the day of its founding, and had served as their flagship ever since. But her strength still paled compared to the combined might the fleet that had marshaled at Silberstadt. An armada had gathered around the planet, the likes of which Ragwell had not seen in many, many years. More than half of Battlefleet Azeroth was already gathered, and he knew there were entire battle groups still in transit. Warships of the Adeptus Mechanicus were also here, behemoths of blessed iron surrounded by flocks of lesser vessels like avatars of the machine god attended by their priests. Even a couple of rogue traders were present, their vessels garish by the standards of the Adeptus Astartes, but no less deadly for all their ornaments. Ragwell himself knew that he was not really different from these ships. He was wearing his Terminator armor, bearing the full regalia of his rank as chapter master. A massive thunder hammer hung from his back, mag locked into place, its machine spirit slumbering. The weapon's name was Elastrios, which meant heaven forged in the dialect of one of the tribes whose children had made up much of the initial tithe of aspirants that had formed the heirs of Sanguinius. Hundreds of merchant ships were still passing through the system, despite the imminent threat, the needs of the Imperium not stopping for war. Even the planet's moon, of which more than a tenth was dedicated to a giant structure filled with administratum's tax offices and data centers, was still bustling with activity. Ragwell wondered if the administratum's officials even knew that war was coming to their preciously ordered kingdom of forms and regulations. In truth, he doubted they did, or would until the moment traitors stormed their offices' very gates. He had met servitors with more awareness of their surroundings than the drones of the Adeptus Terra. More imagination, too. "My lord," called out one of the serfs manning the bridge, "Captain Tyrion is here." Ragwell turned from the oculus just as the gate to the bridge opened, admitting Captain Tyrion of the 5th Company. He strode in, having come from the Call of Retribution strike cruiser by Thunderhawk to answer the summons of his liege lord. Like Ragwell, his power armor was painted red and silver, with the emblem of the chapter, a red teardrop on silver surrounded by a gold ring, on the left shoulder pauldron. An ornate bolter and an elegant power sword completed the captain's panoply, displaying the image of a warrior prince, both terrible on the battlefield and a paragon of nobility outside of it. Like all officers of the chapter, Tyrion strived to embody the ideals of Sanguinius that had been passed on to the successor chapters of the Blood Angels. Tyrion's helm hung from his belt, revealing his face. His skin was ebony dark, like that of many heirs of Sanguinius who had been taken from across Azeroth at the chapter's founding. A single crimson tear was tattooed beneath Tyrion's right eye, marking his century of service into the ranks of the chapter. In the chaplain's sermons, these were the tears they shed for Sanguinius, who gave his life in heroic sacrifice against the arch-traitor Horus to defend his father the Emperor. Would the angel want us to mourn him like this, when so much else has been lost? Wondered Ragwell. So much of the lore concerning Sanguinius was either lost or shrouded in myth. The tradition was one of several new ones, made to honor the ties that bound the heirs to their slain Primarch and the chapter who still bore his legion's name on distant Vale. In time, these traditions would evolve, become sacred within the chapter, a chain that would bind the younger recruits to the veterans of the chapter and its honored heroes. Other traditions included the gold ring worn by each officer and engraved with the name of each warrior who had carried it before, and rituals inherited from the primogenitor chapter revolving around ceremonial blood drinking. For now, though, just like the chapter itself, these were still in their infancy. "We are so young, all of us," thought Ragwell, though he let none of it show on his face. "I am barely 200 years old, but to him and most of my brothers, I am an ancient, a veteran. A source of wisdom, to provide guidance to my younger brethren as we sail into these troubled times." The heirs of Sanguinius were a young chapter, founded in the aftermath of the War of the Beast. Entire chapters from the second founding had been wiped out in that galactic conflict of apocalyptic proportions, and the Lords of Terror had ordered the creation of many new chapters to both replace the losses and expand the reach of the Adeptus Astartes. Partly due to their short existence and partly because of their own origins, the heirs of Sanguinius held a deep fascination for all traces of the past. The chapter's fortress monastery was filled with all manners of records, to the point that the Inquisition had started, if not to investigate, at least to politely cough and raise eyebrows whenever the matter was raised. The chapter master could understand the Inquisitor's discomfort, even if he did not agree with the ruthless suppression of imperial history that the Ordosh had enacted over the course of the centuries since the Emperor had stopped speaking. Order had to be maintained in the Imperium, and sadly, mankind had proved time and again that it could not be trusted to act in its own best interests. For instance, there were stories, hinted at in the chapter's archives, that the High Lords had had to be forced into allowing the fourth founding by the heroes who had slain the Great Beast and severed the head of the Greenskins menace, though Ragwell did not know if they were true or apocryphal. Other, darker stories, spoke of events that had occurred during the war that had been kept secret from all the Imperium, up to its highest-ranking members. No one had ever spoken them aloud, they were more of an impression, a vague sense of malaise in the days that followed the victory at Ullanor that had nothing to do with the cataclysmic losses the Imperium had suffered. That malaise had ran its course across every Space Marine chapter, and Ragwell, in his moments of darkest doubts, thought he knew what its source had been. Of all the successor chapters, there had been one who had not been present at the victory celebrations, one whose every trace had suspiciously vanished over the following decades. He felt that he knew what it meant, and though his Astartes heart knew no fear, he still dreaded the implications. After all, there was only one reason he could think of for an entire chapter to vanish and not be commemorated for his members' sacrifice against the Orcish threat. The possibility was terrible to contemplate, treacherous almost, but it remained within his mind, haunting him like the ghost of a dead foe promising to return to visit yet greater horrors upon those he was sworn to protect. And if he were right, then he could understand why those who did know had done all they could to keep it secret. But how long could it last? How long until whatever tragedy had been hidden away happened again, and this time no one could conceal it before it became widely known? And what would the consequences be, once the Lords of the Imperium knew that even the sons of the 9 true Primarchs could be turned away from the Emperor's light and into darkness? So many questions, and so few definitive answers. Despite all the regard younger members of the chapter held for him, the chapter master's knowledge of the past was still bitterly limited. Ragwell had been alive for the entirety of the heir's existence, and while he and his brothers had proved their worth many times fighting to protect the Azeroth sector, he understood all too well how short 2 centuries were compared to the older chapters, especially the progenitor chapters, whose legacy reached all the way back to the fabled days of the Great Crusade, when the Emperor had marched among mortals. For 200 years, after the purge of the orcs from the Azarok sector had been completed, they had fought against pirates, renegades, and the occasional Xenos raid or occult uprising. Even in this period of relative galactic peace, there was still plenty to occupy the blades of Space Marines, always another call for assistance to answer. Yet the threat that had brought them to Silberstadt was unique. According to the Inquisitors who had issued the call for muster at Silberstadt, it would come from the Wailing Storm, the warp anomaly whose existence had plagued the Azarok sector for hundreds of years. The Abyssian Marcher's name had been changed after the eruption of that storm, which had engulfed the entire Trebedius sector during the time of the Scouring. Much of the evil the heirs of Sanguinius had battled over the years could be sourced to the malevolent presence that stained the void with its baleful light. Pirates hide in the storm's edge, sheltered from imperial justice but twisted by the malignant energies of the Immaterium, while men and women across the Abyssian Marches with barely a sliver of psychic sensibility were driven mad by its influence and became chaos cultists. That corruption had been the storm's only danger, but now another, much more dangerous threat was supposedly about to emerge from it. As a chapter master of the Adeptus Astartes, Ragwell had received much more detailed information than the regiments of the Imperial Guard and the Imperial Navy. Like both of these organizations, he knew that the Ordosh believed that a Black Crusade was coming from the Wailing Storm, a tide of the lost and the damned, accompanied with the spawn of the ruinous powers. But he also knew that there would be Chaos Marines leading these slaves to darkness, ancient traitors from the dawn of the Imperium who had lost their honor and their souls during the distant Horus heresy. He also knew just how the Inquisitors had come to that particular knowledge, and what it had cost them. It couldn't have been easy for the Lord Ackerman to admit that the Ordosh presence in Azarok had been decimated before the war had even truly begun, but the Lord Inquisitor had wanted to impress the magnitude of the threat upon Ragwell, and it had worked. Still, Ragwell thanked Sanguinius that the threat had at least allowed him to meet one of his favorite brothers again. Space Marines sacrificed much in the name of mankind, but the one thing they received in return, the one gift to all Astartes who served the Golden Throne, was brotherhood. Tyrion, Ragwell called out in greeting, before walking toward his brother and embracing him in a warrior's greeting, the two of them locking their forearms together. Chapter Master, replied Tyrion, not calling Ragwell by his given name while they were in the serf's view. I only wish it were under happier circumstances, replied Tyrion, also smiling, though Ragwell could sense the tension in his brother's humors. We are Space Marines, brother, he laughed, leading his brother toward the oculus. These are the circumstances for which we were made what we are. Now, he continued, his expression growing more serious, tell me about what your company encountered on Zetherian Alpha. I read your warriors' reports, but you debriefed them yourself. Is there anything you did not mention in them? Tyrion hesitated for a second, before starting to speak. Everything I was told by the squad that escorted Inquisitor Borland to the surface was in the reports. My librarians scanned their memories for additional information, and found nothing of note. They confirmed that the sigils found in the Archmagus chamber were summoning runes, but that is all. No other facts were uncovered, but... Go on, pressed Ragwell. Do not be afraid to sound ridiculous, brother. We are about to face the agents of the arch-enemy, and must not assume any foulness to be beyond them. Our astropaths have not been well on our way here, Tyrion admitted. And they aren't the only ones. Many of my ship's crew have also suffered from nightmares and hallucinations, more than usual when sailing the Immaterium. They all dreamt of the same thing, a horned demon head, surrounded by burning chains and laughing at them. Even some of my warriors have suffered from the same visions, though it was difficult to get them to admit it to the chaplains. The librarians didn't leave their sanctum for the entire trip, but I doubt they had it any more pleasant than the astropaths themselves. We have all had bad journeys through the warp, but this was something else entirely. I have seen things, brother, even when I am awake. Ragwell nodded gravely. He could see how the confession pained his brother. No Space Marine, no matter his lineage, liked to admit to weakness. But only a fool pretended to be impervious to the warp's pressure. That way lay only damnation. I understand. We have suffered the same difficulties, as has the rest of the fleet, he said, gesturing to the distant dots of the Imperial warships orbiting Silberstadt. The preachers and the commissars are working double time to keep order among the Imperial Guard and the Navy. Lord Admiral Delbaranthia has ordered discipline to be maintained no matter the cost until the Inquisitor Lord arrives to prepare for the next phase of the operation. He shouldn't be long now. Good. We will need whatever guidance the Holy Ordosh can provide in the coming war. The sound of the bridge's gate opening again turned the attention of the two Astartes officers away. A single figure was entering, dressed in white hooded robes and leaning heavily on a staff decorated with the emblem of the Astra Telepathica. The figure advanced toward them, marching slowly, as if every step was a trial. The As guarding the bridge did nothing to impede her advance, for she was known to them, and fully authorized to come onto the bridge at any time she chose. As for the human crew, they sent fearful glances in her direction before going back to their consoles, acting as if she were not here. For her part, she completely ignored them, her full attention on Ragwell. Mistress Euclidia, greeted the chapter master. What tides do you bring us? Euclidia was the Blade of Righteousness mistress of Astropaths, responsible for leading the choir of void singers who received and sent the chapter master's correspondence across the void. Though she was only 30 years old, she looked like a crone, her body ravaged by the demands her service to the chapter put upon it. The journey to Silberstadt had been harrowing to the members of the choir, and Ragwell had ordered them to rest, with only a few of them kept awake at the same time to maintain the lines of communication. But if Euclidia had rested herself, she certainly didn't look like it. If anything, Ragwell thought, she looked even more exhausted now. Considering the effort it took simply for her to walk, she must have important news to deliver, indeed not to trust them to simple vox. Though his face remained calm, Ragwell's body tensed within his armor. I hear the echoes of a scream yet to come, my lord, said the astropath, her voice trembling with fear and exhaustion. It tears through the void, and the immaterium ripples around its power. I see, said Ragwell, though he most certainly did not. If that is all, you should go back to your chambers, mistress, and take what rest you can. Weep. Before he could finish his sentence, the mistress of astropaths collapsed on the spot with a shriek of agony, the smell of her witch blood filling the chapter master's nostrils as it flowed from her sightless eyes. A fraction of a second later, the psychic scream she had foreseen just too late for the warning to be useful hit the rest of the ship, then the rest of the fleet, and madness descended. Plus error, lethal levels of stress detected plus heartbeat failing plus losing connection, plus. The blood called to him. He could sense its proximity, now as then, hiding under soft, frail skin, pumping through veins and arteries, filled with sweet life. He wanted it, craved its sweetness and warmth, craved the sensation of it flowing down his throat as his fangs bit through flesh. He could almost taste it, young blood, but charged with power, so close to him. Was it real, or merely a trick of the mind, the ghost of memory taunting his pain-racked senses? Stay with me, chapter master. Focus on my voice. With the voice came a painful clarity, as it pushed back the madness. It slowed his racing thoughts, cooled his mind with its focus and serenity. It did not bring peace, for it had taken the peace of slumber from him, but it banished the call of the blood, sent it back to the darkness of Ragwell's mind. It brought calm, order, control. Then came the question, and with it, remembrance. What happened when the scream hit you? Asked the voice, and Ragwell could not help but think back to that dreadful moment when the scream pierced through the chapter master's skull, and he heard the madness of the warp booming and echoing in the darkest chambers of his soul. He heard the sea of souls cry out, speaking in tongues no mortal should ever hear. It spoke of a warlord, his soul as black as his armor. It spoke of the destroyers he led, come to build an empire of ruin upon the ashes of hope and reason. And amidst the screams, amidst the fragments of terrible revelation, there was the sound of laughter, ignoble and monstrous as it called out to the dread rage that dwelled within all sons of Sanguinius. Ragwell had to fight to remain in the here and now, to prevent his mind from falling into the darkness. He could not succumb to the black rage, not now of all moments. He fought, but the laughter still reminded him of Horus' own mockery as he rose the blade en carmine in futile defiance, dueling his brother on the bridge of the vengeful spirit while terror burned. No. Ragwell thought, only realizing afterwards he had shouted the word out loud as well. No, he repeated, speaking through gritted teeth. The word, the affirmation of his refusal, helped to anchor him into the here and now, and he rose to his feet, calling out across the vox to all heirs of Sanguinius aboard the blade, brothers, fight it. The mad Nanus shall not claim us today. A chorus of affirmations mixed with howls and pained screams replied to him, and he continued. For though we walk through the valley of death, and the shadow of evil falls upon us forevermore, we shall know no fear," he said, reciting words that had been ancient when he had been a newborn on that distant, lost feral world. "The angel's strength is within us, and through it, the darkness shall find no purchase upon our souls. Such is our duty, and such is our oath, in sanguineous name." "In sanguineous name," came the answer, echoing from hundreds of transhuman throats. The chorus of madness, both psychic and physical, went slowly, grudgingly silent, though Ragwell could still feel the abyss of the black rage waiting, a gaping maw into which the slightest mistake could cast him without any hope of ever emerging again. He forced his thoughts away from doom, and turned his mind to the situation at hand. Several of the bridge crew were rampaging, screaming wordlessly in agony or spouting prophecies of doom and words that belonged to no human language and caused their teeth to explode. As gently as possible, Ragwell and the other heirs on the bridge caught them and neutralized them, though there were still a few bones broken in the process. "Brothers," he spoke once more over the still open Vox link as he worked, "the crew may have been compromised. Ensure that the ship remains under control." Slowly, order returned to the bridge, as crew members either shook off the scream's effects or endured them through sheer force of will. Some were unable to do either, and they were dragged off the bridge, either in restraints to prevent them from hurting themselves further, or in bags to be tossed into one of the ship's morgue, which Ragwell had little doubt would receive many more before the day was done. One of them was carrying Euclidea's body. Ragwell couldn't hear the beating of her heart anymore. While he had been fighting the grip of madness, she had died in service to the Emperor. That was all any of them could hope for. That, and vengeance. "Auspex," he heard the voice of the Blade's human shipmaster call out. Despite the shock Ragwell could smell in the human sweat, his voice was clear and confident, its strength and familiarity helping the rest of the crew fight back the scream's lingering effects. Through the 5 decades Captain Jacques Cimmerian had never once lost his cool. His bionic eyes, replacements for those he had lost in a bridge fire years before when fighting against a band of orc pirates, glinted in the light of the alarms as he took in the reports streaming directly into his mind through the augmetics. He was bleeding from his temple, but was completely ignoring it. "Give us a clear picture of what in the Emperor's name is going on out here," commanded Jacques. "Warp breach detected at the edge of the system," answered one of the crew after a few seconds of frantic activity. "A routing Auspex readings to the main hololith." The display on the bridge's central projection wavered and blinked, before turning into a representation of the Silberstart system. The most glaring feature of the new projection was the vertical wall of errors and imaginary numbers near the mandible point, which Ragwell assumed was the result of the cogitators struggling to render the concept of a breach into the very fabric of reality into understandable data. Across the projection, green dots and icons represented the gathered Imperial fleet. And right next to the warp rift, far closer to the Blade of Righteousness that the ship herself was to the bulk of the Imperial Armada, dozens of red dots were popping into existence as the vessel's Auspex readings were interpreted by the cogitators. Numbers streamed next to each dot, indicating estimated tonnage and energy readings. One projection in particular caught Ragwell's attention, a ship of immense size, sailing at the head of the new fleet. "This one," the chapter master ordered, gesturing toward the image. "Get me an ID on this one." As the officers confirmed his order, every Vox on the bridge began to speak the same words, with a voice Ragwell had grown familiar since his arrival at the muster. It was confident, smooth, charged with the utter certainty of victory that comes from a life of training and generations of breeding. "All ships, this is Lord Admiral Francesco del Branthia. The enemy has come, using foul sorcery to try and gain the advantage before battle is even joined. All ships are to coordinate and advance on the enemy position and prepare for battle." "Understood," replied Cimmerian, before giving new orders to his crew to set the ship on course toward the enemy fleet, slowing the engines so that the rest of the Imperial Armada could catch up to them before they encountered the foe. Judging by the Auspex, it would still be several hours before the battle truly began. "Lords, we have an identification on the enemy's lead vessel. It's the Hand of Ruin," called out the Auspex officer, before gulping as he read further down the length of parchment his station had just spat out. He paled visibly before continuing. "It was last seen during the Siege of Terra, retreating from the system after the death of the War Master. And, my lords, it's a 16th Legion ship." 16th Legion. The Sons of Horus. The thrice-damned spawn of the Arch-Traitor. It took a deliberate effort of will for Ragwell to avoid showing his teeth, and he saw Tyrion struggle against the same urge, and not quite succeed as well as his chapter master. Ragwell caught a flash of pearl-white fangs before the captain reasserted control, forcing down the rage the two of them shared at the mention of the traitor's origin. No matter how much had been forgotten down the centuries, among the descendants of Sanguinius, the blood remembered. Flashes danced before Ragwell's eyes as memories that were not his own tried to replace the reality surrounded him, a ship, grand and corrupt, its walls running with transhuman blood, the screams of the damned echoing in his mind and hearts, the pull of unavoidable destiny toward his doom. No, he told himself again, forcing the visions away. Not now. He forced himself to focus on the here and now, and was pleased to see that Tyrion had also managed to resist the lures of past nightmares. Vengeance would be theirs, but it would not come through giving in to rage. The true strength of a space marine wasn't in his enhanced muscles or his transhuman endurance. It was in his discipline, his fearlessness. To lose that would be to lower himself to the traitor's own level. "Thank you," he managed to say to the officer. According to Imperial law, the man shouldn't have known that the legions had ever existed as anything more than myth, but the serfs of the Space Marine chapters had, by necessity, access to knowledge forbidden to common Imperial citizens. Of course, the traitors hadn't come alone, just as they hadn't been alone when they had brought death and fire to Terra at the command of the arch-traitor Horus. As the fleet came closer, more details became visible. The armada that had emerged from the warp rift was a gathering of vessels of wildly different patterns, united only by the marks of their damnation. Twisted hulks of flesh and metal, bearing unholy runes and bristling with weaponry, along with dozens, hundreds, of transport crafts. If they were filled, then that raised questions as to where the traitors had found so many slaves. The Imperium had assumed the Wailing Storm to be devoid of life, but it seemed that, in fact, they had repeated the mistake made with the Eye of Terror 1,000 years ago. "Chapter Master," came a voice on a private Vox channel. A look at the identifying rune told Ragwell who his caller was. "Lord Admiral," saluted Ragwell. Delbaranthia had no official authority over him, but the chapter master knew the importance to follow protocol in such joint actions. Imperial Navy officers did not rise to their positions of command over tens of thousands of soul by being humble. "I assume you have already learned about the flagship of the heretics? Good. It's the greatest threat we have yet to identify among the enemy fleet. I would like nothing more than to blow it to pieces with the full might of the fleet, but the Inquisitors want us to at least try and capture it so that they can learn the plans behind this incursion." The frustration in the Lord Admiral's voice was obvious, and Ragwell couldn't blame the man. Based on the ancient records and extrapolating where the new, heretical technology of the ship was concerned, the Hand of Ruin was indeed the most powerful vessel within the Chaos Armada. Trying to capture it rather than destroy it would cost many lives, as its guns would be able to fire longer before being silenced. It made the reason behind Delbaranthia's call all the more clear to Ragwell. "This is a Legion vessel, Lord Admiral," he said, knowing he was speaking the Lord Admiral's own thoughts. "Your men will stand no chance within it. Taking it is a job for Space Marines." "Indeed. I want you to take the rest of your chapter's ships and cripple that abomination. Leave it dead in the void so that the Inquisitors can pick at its corpse after we are done here. Can you do this, Lord Ragwell?" "With pleasure, Lord Admiral," replied Ragwell, a predatory smile on his face. "With pleasure." "For the Emperor, then, Chapter Master. Baranthia out." "For the Emperor," Ragwell said as the link went dead. He turned to Cimmerian and nodded, and the human immediately opened transmissions to the other ships of the chapter, coordinating their approach. "You should go back to your ship, Tyrion," said Ragwell, but the captain shook his head. "With respect, Chapter Master, I know you intend for this ship to be the vanguard of our attack. You will need every bolter you can spare, and my second-in-command can take care of the call of retribution." "Very well," conceded Ragwell. "Bring us about to 164.468 degrees starboard," he heard the shipmaster order the crew. "Weapons at the ready, to open fire on the enemy flagship as soon as we are in range." "We have a transmission from the enemy flagship," reported one of the Vox officers. "Patch it through to my armor," ordered Ragwell. "Let's hear what the heretics have to say." Once, he would have commanded the words of his foe to be broadcast on the bridge, that all the trusted human officers could hear it. It would have filled their hearts with rightful hatred, and his own words to the enemy would have strengthened their resolve even further. But that had been before he had hunted down Jeris Tect, the self-proclaimed Demon Queen, a heretical pirate queen whose ships had harassed Azeroth for years before the chapter had tracked the location of her headquarters. Jeris had hailed the herald's ships as they approached the asteroid she had made into her fortress, and Ragwell, then a mere captain, had ordered the transmission be heard by all. He had expected taunts, or a plea for mercy. What he had got instead was a mind-racking scream that had decimated the bridge crew. There had been more to Jeris' title than self-aggrandizement, and the serfs had paid for Ragwell's assumption. Even the captain had been reduced to a mindless, drooling husk, forcing Ragwell and his brothers to assume the functions of the crew in order to salvage the situation. The Imperium had still claimed victory that day. Of course, Ragwell had killed the pirate leader himself. He had ripped off her arms with his bare hands and cast her into her own pits of infernal horrors, to be devoured by the unholy things that dwelt there, and then he had watched as the asteroid fortress detonated, obliterated by strategically placed charges and lance fire. But it had not brought the dead crew members back, nor healed the minds of those who had survived the ordeal. The last time Ragwell had been on the chapter's homeworld, there had still been 2 of them left in the hospital, trapped in a catatonic state, kept alive by machines as they had been for decades. He should have ordered them released long ago, but some part of him felt that would be a grave fault on his part, an attempt to erase the evidence of his failure. Considering the power, cunning and cruelty already displayed by the heretics he now faced, Ragwell wasn't going to take the risk. In this case, however, his caution was unwarranted, for all that came through the Vox link were words, hate-filled, bitter words, but merely words nonetheless. There was static on the link, but the meaning was still clear, as was the fact that it was an Astartes speaking. The voice was too deep to belong to a human. Hail, sons of the angel. Know, before the end, that as you live trapped in your father's shadow, so too shall you die like him, alone, broken, weeping, and in vain. It is you who will die in vain, traitor, spat Ragwell, keeping his voice low. For you have broken your oaths to the Emperor, and only darkness remains for your kind. A cruel laughter came from the other side of the Vox link. It was he who betrayed us first. He who took us from our families and forged us into weapons, to bleed and die so that he could conquer the stars. He who planned to discard us all from the very beginning, who never saw us as anything more than tools for his own ambitions. But we are more than weapons, cousin. After all, here we are, about to kill each other because of our own drives and desires, long after he has become nothing more than a silent corpse sitting atop a throne of lies. He watches, but he can do nothing except send dreams and whispers into the minds of his deluded followers. And he will watch as we burn his deceitful empire to the ground, unable to stop us. Even in failure, Horus accomplished that much, at least. The arch-traitor's heresy accomplished nothing but damn him and all who followed him in his betrayal, growled Ragwell. I am Ragwell, chapter master of the heirs of Sanguinius, and I would know the name of the traitor we are about to kill. A dark chuckle came across the link, followed by words still tainted with cruel amusement. I will tell you my name when we meet in person. It won't be long now, cousin. The link went dead, but Ragwell didn't care. Once more, it was taking all the strength of his will to not succumb to the pull of the past. The taunts and heresies of the traitor had set his blood aflame, and he was gritting his teeth, his elongated fangs cutting into his lower lips and filling his mouth with the taste of his own transhuman blood. He forced himself to relax his jaw, before he succumbed to one of the most easily avoided pitfalls of Sanguinius' gift. As the hours passed and the 2 fleets drew ever closer, Ragwell Alistors remained on the bridge, his eyes closed in meditation, waiting for the battle to erupt. Tyrion went to his side and joined him, reciting words of duty and honor under his breath, calling for the Emperor and the Angel to watch over him and his brothers on this day as they did their work. What's happening? The voice called out, but it wasn't speaking to him this time. The recollection had been shattered, but not because of any spike of emotion on this part like the previous time. Ragwell didn't understand what was happening, the pain of his flesh made focus impossible, and then he heard another voice, distant and utterly devoid of any inflection. There has been a malfunction. The device is shutting down. Damn it, get it back on. We are losing him, shouted the voice he recognized, before once more turning to him. Ragwell. Ragwell, listen to me. What do you remember about the Hand of Ruin? The Hand of Ruin, a leviathan of black steel and mutated fleshy growth, bearing the mark of the chained demon head. He remembered the warships of the chapter coming upon it as the vanguards of the two fleets finally met. He remembered giving the order to board and neutralize it. He remembered. The boarding torpedoes hit the traitor flagship midsection, and disgorged its payload of transhuman killing machines into a waking nightmare. Sergeant Altha of the 4th Company led his 10-man squad into dark corridors whose walls were made of metal and flesh, and the first thing they killed was no renegade but a mutated beast of pale scales and poison-dripping fangs. Had any of the heirs gone unhelmed, they may have tasted a drop of its ichor and learned that it was 17 generations removed from the mutant escaped from the Fleshmaster's labs that was its ancestor. This was the first monster they encountered, but not the last. The goal of Altha's squad was the engineerium deck. Not as prestigious a target as the bridge, but an equally important one. Any competent shipbuilder would have contingencies in place in case the bridge was taken, secondary command centers from which the vessel could still be controlled, if less effectively. The sergeant's helm display showed him an estimated plan of the vessel, with the positions of the other 18 squads who had managed to board. Altha noted the absence of his brother Lucian's rune. His torpedo had been destroyed before reaching the hull. That only 1 in 20 torpedoes had failed to reach its goal was nothing short of a miracle. The Angel was smiling on this mission. Lucian and his squad would be mourned, of course, but only after this was over. As the squad moved deeper into the ship, contact with the other squads grew erratic. Something, or, more likely, a combination of many things, was interfering with the Vox, causing static and bursts of random noises on all frequencies. Demented laughter and horrified screams were prominent among the latter, causing Altha to wonder if their degenerate cousins had truly fallen so low as to expect such cheap tactics to succeed at unnerving space marines. Or perhaps this was the result of the ship's own corruption and not a directed effort. More tangible obstacles soon rose in the squad's path. The Hand of Ruin was a megacity in space, packed to the brim with mutants and heretics of 1,000 kinds. A similar-sized Imperial vessel would have been unable to sustain such a massive population, but creative genetic engineering and the gifts of the Dark Gods had kept the slaves from suffocating or starving until the Black Crusade began. These were the enemies encountered by Altha and his brothers. They cut a path through them with bolter and chainsword, barely slowing as they stormed primitive barricades and slew would-be champions, who hoped to gain the favor of their distant overlords. But the heirs were sanguineous wrath, angels of retribution unleashed within the fetid pits of hell, and none could stand against them. Yet eventually, amidst the fervor of battle, it dawned on Altha that they were lost. The ship's layout was unlike anything he had ever encountered, with corridors looping back on themselves in impossible ways. The radio interference made it difficult to gauge whether or not they were truly closer to their goal. Even following the noise of engines was an unreliable method, as sounds echoed in strange ways throughout the metal, and the cables and pipes that would have led the way on an Imperial vessel were impossible to distinguish from the more organic conduits here. The squad had kept track of its advance, their armor's machine spirits noting every turn, but Altha was fairly certain that, should they retrace their steps, they wouldn't be able to find their way back to the boarding torpedo, which was their only way out of the ship. So be it. They had all known the odds of survival were slim. Death was the reward of duty, but failure was unacceptable. They had to find their target before even their inhuman stamina started to fade from the relentless killing of worthless chaff, for surely the Engineerium would be defended by better forces, traitor Astartes, if the warlord leading this gathering of the lost and the damned had any strategic sense at all left in his diseased mind. The squad reached an ornate portal, once a bulkway leading into another section of the ship. Sorcerous markings covered its surface, and piles of skulls and other bloody morsels had been laid before it like offerings to some ruinous shrine. Looking at the symbols and devotions made Altha's head hurt, and he could feel the thirst growing stronger. "We should not stay here," said Neros, turning away from the portal to stare back the way they had come, bolter at the ready for any sign of pursuit. "I agree," replied Altha, "but as best as I can tell, our only way forward is—" He stopped, as a rumbling sound began emanating from the gate. Slowly, as if struggling against a great force, the door opened, splitting many sigils in two as it did so, their inner light flickering and dying with a sigh. The stench of blood flowed out of the confined space beyond, overpowering the filters on Altha's helmet. The smell was a mix of old and fresh vitae, from a great number of sources, human, mutant, Xenos, and Astartes. It made Alpha's throat go dry even as his stomach lurched in repulsion, an all-too-common reaction to abattoirs among the Sons of the Angel, and he invoked the mantras of the chaplains, drilled into his head back when he was only an initiate feeling the first touch of the red thirst. By fighting an eternal battle against the monster within, the Az proved their worth of sanguineous legacy of nobility and devotion to the Emperor. Still, it took several seconds for Alpha to fully control himself, and a look at his squadmates' bio readings told him that some of them were still struggling against the curse. He opened his mouth to chastise them, but was interrupted again by a deep, bellowing roar from the darkness ahead. Bolters snapped toward the opening as thunderous, quickening footsteps followed the roar, accompanied by bestial snarling. The sensors of Alpha's armor could detect the source. It was big, vaguely humanoid, and radiated the heat of a furnace. "Open fire!" he shouted, and as his squad obeyed, the creature became visible, illuminated by the light of muzzle flares. It was tall, nearly 4 meters high even when stooped as it was. In its right hand, it held a giant axe, whose edge was covered in sharp, ivory teeth dripping acid onto the deck. Bone spurs rose from its back like the roots of lost wings, carved with blasphemous runes. The remnants of crimson and bronze ceramite that clung to its skinless muscles were barely identifiable enough to recognize that the creature had once been a space marine. Its face was a vision of hell, the jaw was canine-like, except all the teeth were sharp fangs, and the upper half was still clad in a twisted helmet whose eye lenses glowed with infernal light. Alpha could make out silhouettes in that blaze, twisting in agony as they consumed eternally within it. Bolt shells hammered into it as it charged, bursting muscle and spilling gallons of blood, but doing nothing to slow it down. The wounds healed as soon as they appeared, unmade by the demon spawn's unnatural vitality. The monstrosity opened its mouth, and 2 voices emanated from between blood-dripping fangs. Blood for the blood god. Skulls for the skull throne. The axe flew with a speed that belied the thing's size and caught Brother Kilio's midsection, severing him in 2 without slowing. The Az scattered before the return blow, still firing focused bursts at the abomination. Thousands of kilometers away, on the bridge of the Blade of Righteousness, Raguel swore as his brother's picked feed was cut at the same time as his thread. Andros' feed had been but one of his brothers whose progress through the traitor flagship he had been monitoring, but it had also been the last still open. For the last hour, the chapter master had watched nearly 200 of his brothers spend their lives in the belly of that infernal vessel. And while no one would question that they had died as heroes, in the end they had failed in their objectives. The Hand of Ruin remained perfectly functional. 1/5 of the chapter was lost, but the attempt had to be made. Space Marines were designed to be the spear, aimed at the heart of the foe, their individual might doing what mere numbers could not. Raguel vowed that his brother's death would not be in vain. The footage of the ship's insides, and the monsters that dwelled there, was already being prepared for transmission to the rest of the sector, heavily encrypted and sent to one of the courier ships of the fleet. There was too much data to risk it to the vagaries of astropathic transmission, and the warp singers were too shaken to send anything anyway. The Inquisition, who had known of the coming attack but whose leaders had yet to arrive, and Raguel wasn't sure what to make of that, would doubtlessly find much to learn from the records. But that was a concern for later. Right now, all that mattered was the void battle, and while the traitors had the advantage thanks to the disorder caused by the unholy scream, the Imperial fleet was still far from done. "My lord. We have new warp signatures inbound on the Mandeville Point." "More traitors?" he shouted to be heard above the din of alarms. "No, my lord. We have their identifications, it's the fleet of Admiral von Krugerich." There was exultation in the officer's voice, and after a glance at the updated tactical hololith, Raguel could see why. The new arrivals were in perfect position to flank the Chaos Armada. Von Krugerich would be the hammer to the main battle group's anvil. As soon as the ship's auspexes had recovered from warp transit, they would open fire. The Admiral had been smart, or paranoid, enough to have his ships travel in combat formation and emerge from the Empyrean with shields raised and guns at the ready. With any luck, he would get over the shock of the invasion scope quickly. He had to attack before the traitors could react, cripple them before they could launch boarding actions of their own. Already commands from the Lord Admiral were coming in, the Imperial fleet moving to engage the hated foe. Any moment now, the Blade of Righteousness's auspexes would report the first shots being fired from Krugerich's battle group toward the traitor armada. Any moment. But the moment passed, and Ragwell frowned in incomprehension. Why hadn't the ships opened fire yet? The traitor fleet had just entered optimal range for their lance weaponry. With each passing second, the Imperial vessels risked being subjected to return fire. Why? Then the reason behind that inaction was revealed, painted across the void in blood and fire. The recollection shattered as a crimson haze descended upon the warrior who should be dead. Rage filled him, black and hot, and he felt his pain redouble as he struggled in his fury to move, to strike, to do anything. He wanted to crush, to destroy, to vent his anger onto something, anything. Stay with me. Ragwell, you must stay focused. What happened? What did Krugerich do? Krugerich. That name brought pain and fire. That name made the anger even worse. Ragwell. Your anger is killing you. Stay focused. Krugerich. Worthless, honorless cur. 1,000 curses upon his name and his wretched soul. Ragwell. In the name of the Emperor, I command you. Remember. Krugerich. Krugerich had betrayed them. The cold weight of realization warred with Fury's raging inferno in Ragwell's breast as he watched the new ships open fire, not on the Chaos Armada, but on the Imperial fleet. The blade of righteousness shook as shells fire from Imperial guns impacted first her void shields. The battle barge's place in the vanguard and her allegiance marked her as a priority target. But Ragwell knew the enemy would not simply blast them apart, even before the Hand of Ruin began its course toward them. No, they were going to do to the blade what the heirs had tried to do to the Hand. They were going to try to board them, to capture the ship and kill her current masters. Then they would twist her in their own corrupt image with their foul techno-sorcery, and use the hollowed revenant that would be left in their war against the Emperor. Not as long as I live, vowed Ragwell, before turning to his Vox officer. With the battle for space so utterly lost, trying to hold Silberstar itself was a fool's errand. They must evacuate the planet and regroup elsewhere. But just retreating from the Chaos Fleet would only lead to slaughter. Lord Admiral Del Baranthia had come to the same conclusion. His face taut with contained fury, he gave the order to the fleet to withdraw, giving commands to groups of ships to remain in orbit long enough to evacuate the forces mustered there and shouting directions. The fleet could not simply retreat together to another system. The warp would not allow for such a precise and coordinated withdrawal. They must scatter the fleet, to fight back another day. It clearly galled Del Baranthia to give such orders, but Ragwell only admired him for it. A flicker of bitter amusement passed through his mind when he noticed that the administratum drones on Silberstar's moon had finally started to act, calling in private vessels to evacuate the higher-ranking officials and the most important archives, and the amusement turned to anger when he realized that they were abandoning most of the thousands who labored there to save data stacks instead. But there wasn't anything he could do about it. He had another duty. Inform the Lord Admiral that we are volunteering to stay back and hold the enemy in order to cover the retreat, Ragwell commanded the Vox officer. If he protests, tell him that while we accept his concern with gratitude, there is no way the blade can disengage without excessive sacrifices from the rest of the force. Then call the rest of the chapter's fleet and tell them to join the retreat. The heirs of Sanguinius will not die today, and if any of them protest, tell them that it is an order and that we haven't time for any discussion. The 4 other ships of the chapter began to turn almost at once, staying on the back fringes of the withdrawal. Ragwell could ask them to run, but their captains would not be the first to flee. They would keep any Chaos ships that reached the fleet off the troop carriers. Tyrion, Ragwell called out to his brother. You should go back to your ship at once. The chapter will have need of leaders to fight the war against these heretics. I will not leave you to die, brother, grunted Tyrion in response. And I will not turn my back on these traitor. Br0 Ken. I have already spoken to my second-in-command. He will lead the 5th as well as I could while I stand alongside you here. Despite the gravity of the situation, despite the fury burning in his breast, Ragwell couldn't help himself. He chuckled. Brotherhood. No matter what the archenemy or any of the other countless threats to mankind threw at the Space Marines, they could never truly destroy that one thing. Very well. So be it, brother. I will handle the bridge, you go join the rest of our brothers. Tyrion and Ragwell locked arms in the manner of warriors, both knowing that this would very likely be the last time they ever saw each other. Then Tyrion turned, locking his helmet in place on his way out of the bridge. Ragwell closed his eyes for a few seconds, silently reciting a mantra of focus and devotion. Then he raised his hand and triggered the iron halo that replaced his armor's helmet, one of the few artifacts the chapter had inherited from those who had come before. "Brothers," he began, speaking on a general frequency that would be heard by every heir of Sanguinius aboard. "Our foe is bringing the battle to us. They think they can kill us and take what belonged to the Emperor, as they have done for centuries. But they will find in us an adversary ready to face them. Though we may all kneel at the foot of the golden throne before the day is done, we shall reap a tithe of traitors' lives such that we need not be ashamed of our service to the angel." Once again, his brothers answered with a battle cry of their own, more reserved and determined this time. Ragwell knew all of them were ready to give their lives for the Imperium. They had been since the day they had taken the first step on the path that had made them Astartes. But he had not just sentenced them all to their death, he had also deprived each of the 100 Space Marines aboard the Blade of Righteousness from the enduring legacy which was every Astartes' right. Their progenoid glands would not be harvested and used to create the next generation of heirs of Sanguinius. In fact, if the gene seed wasn't abandoned to rot, there was a very high probability that it would be desecrated by the Chaos Marines. Such was the true sacrifice Ragwell had asked his brothers to make when he had commanded the blade to stay back. "Sanguinius, forgive me. Angel, let their sacrifice not be in vain." The blade shook as her shields trembled with the focused fire of the traitor fleet. Her own guns fired back, destroying several smaller crafts. Cimmerian knew they wouldn't be able to take down the Hand of Ruin's shields without the support of the fleet, and instead focused on inflicting as much damage as possible on the Chaos Armada, facing his own death and that of his crew with all the stoicism and determination Ragwell could possibly ask for. Though this was precisely the result sought by the orders he had given, Ragwell couldn't help but think that his plan was working a little too well. The bulk of the Chaos Armada had stopped, with only small groups breaking off and passing by the engagement to pursue the retreating Imperial fleet. Was the rest unwilling to go before their flagship and risk offending their Dark Master? Did they fear that the retreat was just an elaborate feint, and feared being caught and destroyed piecemeal if it turned back? Or, Ragwell's train of thought was interrupted as the blade's shields finally collapsed in a shriek of protesting consoles and feedback into the generators that caused every onboard light to flicker for a few seconds. The battle barge trembled as a few last volleys struck into her hull, but the traitors had good fire discipline and the attacks stopped soon. They were replaced on the Auspex by a flow of boarding torpedoes, assault boats, and fighter crafts. With the shields down, the Chaos Marines and their minions were coming to seize the Blade of Righteousness. Soon, battle began aboard the corridors of the battle barge as squads of Chaos Marines and a veritable army of mutated beasts and corrupted soldiers poured in. For several minutes, Ragwell listened to the sound of war, and then it came to the bridge itself, as he had known it would. Warp-borne lightning cracked along the deck, cooking the flesh of servitors and destroying consoles before gathering into the open space before the bridge's main entrance, where it coalesced into a bright light that blinded Ragwell for a few seconds. He had seen teleportation before, but this was unlike any of the manifestations preceding it he had witnessed. He could not fathom the vile and forbidden dark tech that had gone into this, nor did he care to. As his vision returned, all of the chapter master's attention was focused on the silhouettes that had appeared in the spot where the sorcerer sunlight had gathered. There were 10 of them, all radiating malevolence and clad in bulky, corrupted Terminator armor. The war gear of the renegades was painted black and gold, the colors of the infamous Black Legion that had led the way of the traitor legions during the Black Crusade that had poured out of the Eye of Terror centuries ago. But the emblem on the legionaries' shoulders and breastplates was different from the Eye of Horus surrounded by the Chaos Star that was the symbol of Abaddon's mongrel army. It was that of the chained demon head that the Inquisitors had encountered across the Azeroth sector prior to the destruction of their conclave. In time, the Inquisitors would investigate the history of this offshot of the traitor legions, but Ragwell did not care for the origins of these renegades. Tusks and horns rose from the traitors' helmets, giving them the aspect of demons to match the corruption of their souls. Unholy sigils glowed upon their ancient war plate and the power weapons they brandished. The air around them rippled with leftover warp energy, and Ragwell thought that he could see the screaming faces of the traitors' previous victims in the fell illumination. They were the first Chaos Marines Ragwell had ever seen with his own eyes, and they were exactly as vile as he had imagined them to be. They were twisted parodies of the chapter's true strength, warped by their devotion to unholy powers into walking avatars of corruption and ruin. Then Ragwell saw the one the Terminators escorted, and all thoughts of these lesser warriors' evil faded away. The Lord of the Terminators was a giant, taller even than his brothers in damnation and filled to bursting with fell energies. His bare head was bald and scarred, his eyes glowed with unholy fire, and the image of a chained demon head was carved in tarnished gold upon the chest plate of his armor, which was an unnatural blackness that seemed to swallow all light. Ragwell raised Elastrios, not in salute, but in an overhead two-handed grip, and charged, sanguineous name on his lips. The warhammer flew, and smashed into the head of one of the Terminators. The helmet's horns shattered under the blow, then its black ceramite and the skull and brain it contained followed suit, the tainted brain meat sizzling as it was cooked by the weapon's power field. An axe slammed against Ragwell's flank, but the blow failed to penetrate his blessed armor, and he barely stumbled before bringing his weapon back for another swing. Corrupted warplate cracked under his blow, and the traitor fell, leaking blood, oil, and other, fouler fluids. The chapter master kept moving, charging toward the Chaos Lord. Other Terminators clashed across the bridge as the elite of the First Company engaged the renegades. More of the traitors tried to block Ragwell's path, but their master waved them aside with a gesture, his claws glinting in the emergency lights, his face twisted in a malevolent sneer. Ragwell's warhammer came down, only for the weapon to be caught by its haft mere centimeters from the heretic's bald skull. Ragwell struggled with all the strength conferred to him by his gene-forged body and his tactical dreadnought armor, but the grip of the Chaos Lord was unrelenting. The creature's smile widened, pale lips parting to reveal fanged, engraved teeth. "Chapter Master Alistors," he said, and Ragwell recognized the voice with which he had spoken before the void battle had begun. But the voice was more than mere sound carried across the air, it burned within Ragwell's mind, every word causing the beast in his blood to rise and rage, crying out for the blood of Horus' son. "I am Archon the Awakened, Lord of the Forsaken Sons." "I care not what you call yourself, traitor," Ragwell spat through clenched teeth. Drawing upon the strength granted unto him by his rage, he ripped his warhammer free of the traitor's grip and pivoted for a circular strike at the renegade's chest. "Oh, but you should," replied Archon, dodging Ragwell's blow by less than a millimeter, the weapon's power field scorching the golden demon head on his armor, causing the sculpture to reveal itself as disgustingly alive as it snarled in response. "For one should always know the name of one's killer. You will not be my killer. I shall be the one to end your miserable life." "Do you expect this to be some heroic duel between commanders?" mocked Archon. "Do you think you will kill me in honorable single duel before being gunned down by my guards? Do you think your name will go down in imperial history as a martyr to the false emperor? You are wrong." At the precise moment the Chaos Lord finished speaking, something struck the bridge with the strength of a titan. The armor glass panel of the main oculus shattered, and the atmosphere of the bridge fled into the void, taking many serfs and servitors along with it. Ragwell stumbled under the pull before his armor's magnetic boots activated, locking him to the deck. None of the traitors, he noted, had been taken by surprise, they had known the attack would come. Before Ragwell could regain his footing, Archon was on him, moving far more quickly than he had before. With a single swipe of his claws, he cut off both of Ragwell's arms at the wrist, and Elastrios was sucked into the void along with the hand still clutching its shaft. The chapter master raised his stumps, trying to block the onslaught, but Archon continued to strike, tearing at the blessed ceramite until Ragwell was forced to his knees, his entire body burning with pain. "It seems I was wrong. You are not going to die like your father. After all," he continued, his face twisted in contempt, "for all his many faults, Sanguinius was never as pathetically weak as you." The warlord raised his claws, ready to deliver the death blow, but then, suddenly, he stopped, and cocked his head, the motion making his warped Terminator armor whine in protest as its joints tried to follow it. Archon stared at Ragwell with something like curiosity gleaming in his cold, inhuman eyes. His lips curled in a cruel parody of amusement, revealing rune-marked teeth. "I see you, Inquisitor." Then he struck, and the lightning-shrouded talons pierced through Ragwell's chestplate and into his flesh, tearing at organs and blood vessels, but missing both of his hearts. Still the warlord was smiling, his words no longer addressed to Ragwell, but to someone else, someone who wasn't here. Through the pain, Ragwell wondered if he was about to be slain by a deluded madman. "Know this, "Little slave of the corpse god, I have come to bring death and fire to Azeroth, and there is nothing you and your allies can do to stop me." Arkan raised his arm, lifting Raguel off the ground. Then, with a mighty heave, he threw the chapter master through the broken oculus and into the airless void, his blood, sanguineous blood, flowing from terrible wounds as his physiology strained to close them in the less than optimal conditions. Raguel tried to reach, to cling to something, but he was too weak, and soon he was floating in the void, the burning silhouette of the Blade of Righteousness diminishing in the distance. Cold bit into him as all air and heat fled his torn armor. As darkness closed in, the last thing he saw was the silhouette of the Chaos Lord who had brought the Black Crusade to Azeroth, still standing amidst the ruins of the Battle Barge's bridge, immobile as a statue while he watched Raguel fly away. And the last thought to cross the chapter master's mind before unconsciousness took him was a curse aimed at his killer, calling the Emperor's wrath upon the foul, ancient traitor. Lord Inquisitor Elaidios Ackerman yanked his hand away from the preservation casket, face pale and eyes wide. For several seconds, he simply stared at the mangled, ruined body within, hooked up to dozens of cables linked to the priceless archaeotech devices that had dragged the chapter master back from clinical death and allowed for the psychic communion. He could easily fill in the blanks after Raguel's loss of consciousness, and went over the story one more time. From what the tech priests had been able to tell, after the bridge was lost, the remaining heirs of Sanguinius had gathered in the Engineerium. There, they had made their last stand, buying time for the tech marines and engineers to set the generators of the battle barge into overdrive. According to psychic readings of ceramite fragments, the Forsaken Sons had nearly all fled before the explosion, but at least the ship had been denied to the traitors. A small victory, but an important one. The Chaos Fleet was powerful enough without adding the might of such a vessel to it. Perhaps Elaidios' agents would be able to spine a nice bit of propaganda from the whole affair, the noble angels, fighting the arch-enemy until the very end, sacrificing their lives in service to the God Emperor. The Imperium would need every moral boost it could get in Azeroth, after this disaster. And it was a disaster, that much couldn't be questioned. In the end, Raguel's decision to sacrifice the heirs of Sanguinius' flagship hadn't been quite enough, and Delbaranthia had led the volunteer force that had bought the remaining time needed to evacuate the forces on Silberstadt. The Lord Admiral had died with his ship, conveniently erasing the dishonor his defeat had brought upon his lineage and dumping the job of finding a successor on Elaidios' lap. With the navy scattered as it was in the aftermath of the retreat, choosing a new Lord Admiral was going to be a nightmare, tactically, logistically, and politically. Things would have been much simpler if Delbaranthia had been a more typical Imperial high-echelon official and had run to save his own life. Then Elaidios could have kept him in charge and then execute him for cowardice once the Black Crusade had been dealt with. Silberstadt, once the jewel of the Azeroth sector's defenses, was now a smoking ruin. The Black Crusade's armada had pummeled the fortress world from orbit until nothing was left of its mighty strongholds but rubble. Even their great void shields had not been enough, and the chemical residues of the planet's purge centuries ago had ignited under the excessive heat, leaving entire landmasses charred black. With its loss, the Imperium's best chance to stop the Black Crusade at its gates had slipped between their fingers. Analysis of the battle's logs had confirmed the instincts Elaidios had found within Raguel's recollection. It had indeed been the betrayal of Admiral Krigorich that had turned the tides. We were blind again, thought Elaidios. By the Emperor, this has to stop. Questions filled his mind, one of them dominating all the others. Why? Why had the Chaos Lord, Arkan the Awakened, spoken to Elaidios in such a way? How wasn't that difficult? The monster was filled with the power of the warp, and time meant little to the Empyrean. But the mind that had engineered the crippling of the Conclave, the gathering of a Black Crusade, the treachery of von Krugorich, such a mind did nothing without a purpose. Mere gloating at an enemy in disarray was not reason enough, so why? To sow doubt and confusion as to his motives? To make them underestimate him, thinking that he was just one more blood-crazed warlord? Elaidios took a deep breath, and calmed his swirling thoughts. Focus, he told himself. Wild speculation would achieve nothing at this stage. Chapter Master Raguel Alistors needed his help. The entire Azeroth sector needed his help, the hubris of the thought be damned. It would need every single one of its very few inquisitors left, and every single one of its ships and soldiers. The small, Heavily modified Gladius-class frigate Judgments floated hundreds of thousands of kilometers away from the Silberstadt system's Mandeville point, in the depthless abyss that truly separates stars from one another. Its run into the system had been extremely risky, but Ackerman had insisted, and no one had dared to question the new Lord Inquisitor and Master of the Azeroth Conclave, such as it was. At least not in public. In private, Alphon had been more than willing to explain to his lord how foolish the idea was at excruciating lengths. But Ackerman had maintained his decision. The astropathic messages that had come from Silberstadt in the aftermath of the disaster were too imprecise and tainted by the terror of their senders to be of any tactical use, while the scattered forces of the Imperium were still being accounted for and gathered back together. They needed hard, trustworthy intelligence. Alphon hadn't objected to any of that, of course. The mysterious Inquisitor knew better than anyone the value of information. He had objected to the fact that Ackerman, who was, for better or worse, the effective leader of the Imperial defense in Azeroth, should be the one to risk his life to obtain that information. Elidios agreed with his advisor, but they had already been on their way to Silberstadt when the astropaths had perceived the psychic echoes of the disaster. Thankfully, most of the Black Crusade's fleet had already departed from Silberstadt, leaving in separate groups that had sailed into the conduits leading the rest of Azeroth. It reminded Elidios of a plague, pouring into an open wound and using the body's own arteries to spread. The Lord Inquisitor wondered how much flesh would need to be excised to defeat that particular infection. The remaining ships, including the Hand of Ruin, were undergoing minor repairs, salvaging the battlefield, or plundering Silberstadt's shipyards. Soon they too would be gone. Elidios had no idea what foul plots they would unleash upon the sector, but what had already been revealed to bait the Conclave into gathering left him with little doubt that the Forsaken Sons would have plenty of cells left in Imperial space, awaiting their coming to rise against their rightful masters. More worlds would burn before the end. That was inevitable. As had been done before, so would it be done again to keep the secrets that mankind could not be trusted to know. Such pride, whispered a treacherous voice in the back of his head. Such confidence in your inevitable victory, in your own importance. But what if you lose? What if this is the Black Crusade that ends the Imperium once and for all, and ushers in the Age of Chaos? He crushed that thought under his iron will. Defeat was impossible. He may perish, for that matter, the entire Azeroth sector may perish if he failed utterly in his duty. But the Imperium will endure. The great beast, Abaddon, Horus himself, they had all failed to bring it down. What hope did this Archon have? The Lord Inquisitor turned from the still form of Raguel and left the sterile, warded chamber where the chapter master and the machine that had returned him to half-life were kept. A trio of figures awaited him: Alphon, his face as carefully neutral as always, a tech priest whose entire visage had been replaced by knots of cables and glowing eye lenses, and a bare-headed, grizzled space marine in red and silver armor who towered over both. Captain Medell of the heirs of Sanguinius 10th Company had been delayed on his way to Silberstadt by warp turbulences, which had resulted in him and the scouts under his guidance being spared from the slaughter. Elidios had found him and his cruiser skulking at the system's edge, searching for their chance to go examine the wreckage of the Blade of Righteousness without drawing the attention of the traitors remaining in the system. The Judgments had been far better suited for that task, and had delivered Medell along with a mixed squad of his scouts and the Inquisition's operatives aboard the biggest pieces of the battle barge to uncover what had happened. "He was dead when we brought him aboard," said the heir of Sanguinius, going straight to the point Elidios had known he would make from the beginning. The captain was making an admirable effort to hide his unease, but Elidios was an inquisitor, and had spent his life dealing with individuals far more gifted at deception than the Space Marine. A cold corpse, claimed by the Void. "I thought you were going to cut him apart to learn how he had died, and I endured the thought of such desecration because after this disaster, we need to know everything we can. But this, what manner of witchcraft is this, that brought him back to life from such a wretched state? And how can you be sure it really is him in there? I have heard stories of such necromantic devices being used on the galactic fringes, or among the blackest of heretics." "Oh, it is him," assured Elidios. "And the only witchcraft that took place here was that which allowed me to commune with him. It is the machine that brought him back, the machine and the Emperor's gifts. No one but an Astartes of his strength could have been rescued from such extensive damage." "I wouldn't call it rescue," Medell almost spat. "Have you seen what he has become? What remains of him? There is almost nothing left of the warrior he was before. He is not the first Space Marine to undergo such traumatic injuries, nor shall he be the last, replied the Lord Inquisitor before turning toward the tech priest. Is the shell ready? It is, Lord Inquisitor, replied one of them. The conditions are highly irregular, as you know. But we have performed the rituals, and I believe the Omnissiah will allow our endeavor to succeed. Then begin at once. The device brought him back, but it cannot help him anymore, and we will need the chapter master in this war. Fear not, Captain, Lord Ragwell shall walk again. With these words, Elidios departed, followed closely by Alphon. Medel remained in the medical bay, determined to watch until his chapter master either awakened or slipped into death one last time. They passed other Space Marines laid down upon operation tables. The judgments will had found a handful of escape pods that had escaped the notice of the traitors, containing warriors wounded nigh unto death that their brothers had placed in the crafts in the hope that some of them might endure. Only one of them had still been alive when they had found him, identified by Medel, and now Ragwell's recollections, as Captain Tyrion of the 5th Company. It was yet to see if Tyrion would live. From what the Medicae could tell, he had taken several chainsword blows to the gut. Before they had found the chapter master's body, Elidios had been about to use his communion device upon him. That wouldn't help now. Several of the machine's components had burned out, returning the chapter master to the very edge of life, and Elidios doubted he would ever have the opportunity to replace them. Perhaps that was for the best. Medel's discomfort actually echoed his own at using such means, though he had concealed it well. The two inquisitors walked alone for a couple of moments before Alphon asked the question Elidios had been waiting for him to ask since they had arrived in the system. What do we do now? We fight back. We gather everything we can, every regiment, every ship, every ally. Our enemy has made one mistake in his moment of triumph. He has spread his forces across Azeroth. If we can gather enough troops, we can go after their divided forces and destroy them one by one. There are still billions of the Emperor's soldiers in this sector, and reinforcements are coming from beyond. It is not a question of if we will win, my friend, said Elidios, trying to convince himself as much as the other Inquisitor, but when, and how much it will cost us to do so. Nice speech. Do you actually believe that? Elidios laughed, a bitter, dry laugh entirely devoid of amusement. No. This awakened one, he has a plan beyond mere carnage and ruin. He seeks something in Azeroth, and for the love of the Emperor I do not know what. We must find out, Alphon. I feel as if all of this entire Black Crusade, is a smokescreen to mask his true intention. He wouldn't be the first one, replied Alphon.